Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I am your host, Steven Pynakker, and this month's book giveaway, which happens to also be the very person who sent me the book, is a preparatory redemption reading Alma 12 through 13. And she wrote a paper. She sent me 2 copies, and she was nice enough to put money in my PayPal account to pay for the postage for whoever wins this, which is really cool. So authors, that's how you get on there. But she wrote a paper called and Ordained, a Priesthood of All Believers in Alma 13. And so this is a great publication. So Bridget Jack Jeffries, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Steve.
So what makes your story so fascinating, folks, and this is going to be a really, I think, interesting interview. Now, many of you have probably seen my interview with Leah Merritt, who's a student at BYU, and she's an evangelical there. And actually, Bridget got in touch with me because she's like, hey, I was Leah Merritt before Leah Merritt, and you were so you were very heavily involved at Brigham Young University. But this is the thing, as an evangelical Christian. And actually, you even said, I think, and we're going to get into this story, at the age of 16, you felt called to go to BYU right around that age, right? Yes. So this is another interesting story about an evangelical who engages the restoration in much of the way that Leah is, that I am, and many others. So it's a fascinating story. And people have mentioned you to me before. I heard about you, and I was like, wow, it's great to know there's another unicorn out there. We're not alone.
There's a couple of us.
There's a few of us, yeah. And so, Bridget, I just kind of want to open this up with, how does a evangelical end up at BYU University? But that's not the question I'm asking. We're going to lead up to that, and then we're going to talk about that. So before we get there, I want us to tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, your religious background, your familial situation, and just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. So I don't have any Mormon family members. I'm a little unique among non-Mormons who engage with Mormonism for that reason. And I did not come from much of a religious family at all. My dad was nominal Baptist. My mom was nominal Nazarene, but we really did not go to church. I called them Christmas Christians later on. Like, if you ask them, they'd be like, I accepted Jesus Christ as my savior. We're saved. But we never talked about God. We never went to church. I didn't really grow up knowing Jesus, knowing God. I'm sorry to get dark so early, but I also grew up in kind of a dysfunctional family. This becomes important when I encountered Mormonism later on. My father, Christmas Day, 1997, I was 15 years old. He punched me in the stomach. My mother beat me pretty brutally when I was young, when she got drunk with a wooden spoon. She beat me. And this was a long time ago, and they're forgiven. And I've made peace with my family of origin issues, and I've made peace. I've forgiven them. My mom's been dead for many years. My dad, I still have a relationship with. That's not my point. My point is just that later on, when I encountered Mormons and I kind of saw these peaceful, wholesome families, there was some part of me that really wanted that. There was some part of that that really resonated with me, that I thought I could have that with them. But so originally I wasn't religious though, but then later we moved. I grew up in Alaska, so I was kind of isolated from extended family up in Alaska, and we moved to the Seattle area. And I got in touch with my aunt, who was Nazarene, and she told me about Jesus, and she converted me to Christianity. But I had a hard time at the Nazarene youth group, and then later I found a different church, which was Presbyterian Church USA. I didn't know about denominations, though. I was told, you go where God wants you, and it doesn't matter where you get baptized. It matters what your relationship with Jesus is. So I remember I asked the Nazarene youth pastor how he felt about me leaving for the Presbyterian Church USA, and he said, if you feel like that's where God wants you, you can go with my blessing. So later, Mormons tried to tell me that Protestants always bicker and can't get along and they fight, and this was confusing to me because I'd had a very wholesome experience with one denomination seeing to my care and kind of giving me over to another denomination. But that was where I was when I encountered Mormons. I wasn't really like Calvinist, but I was attending a Presbyterian Church USA, which is a more mainline church, but our local church was fairly evangelical, was fairly conservative.
And just real quick too, is that, for instance, just so people understand, the Nazarene church comes from the Wesleyan holiness tradition, also Armenian,
Yep.
when they view like the role of salvation, whereas you then transition to a Calvinistic type church. So
Yep.
maybe these are historically warring factions within Protestantism, two
Yep.
rival positions. And but it does go to show that in the 19th century, even well into the 20th century, these groups were, there was a lot of tension there. But now we have seen that within and evangelicalism, in one sense, has helped kind of soften those edges. Maybe even the charismatic renewal movement kind of helped with these things, where it kind of broke down a lot of these barriers in the 60s and 70s, so that now you can easily transition from a Nazarene church to a Presbyterian church, whereas historically you couldn't. But that's kind of the state of the evangelical church today. Would you agree?
Oh, for sure. And not only did I leave, but my aunt actually left. She became an elder in the Presbyterian church. My uncle became a deacon, her husband. My cousin, their daughter, became the assistant youth minister there. So I came over myself, and I brought part of my family, at least my aunt and uncle's family, with me. And it was a smooth transition. I don't think people were hurt that we left from one to the other. It was kind of like, if this is where God is calling you to, then this is where you go. Even though these were pretty different traditions historically.
Yeah.
So that was where I was, though, when I encountered Mormonism. Now, I've got to say, again, with my own personal background and my insecurities, you can't tell because I'm sitting down, but I am 6 feet tall. And one of the things you learn when you're a 6 foot tall woman is that there's a lot of guys who say they're 6 feet tall until they meet you. And then they're like, well, you must be taller than 6 foot. There's an old joke. The difference between a 6 foot tall woman and a 6 foot tall man is the 6 foot tall woman is telling the truth. But I'm a half inch taller than my father. I was several inches taller than my mother. And I kind of had like this giant crooked nose, and I was very insecure about myself. So I'm a teenager, I'm 16, I get the internet, I start getting into chat rooms, and I strike up kind of this online romance with a guy that I'm going to call Sean. And Sean's in Pennsylvania. It was entirely online, but Sean is Mormon. And we start talking. Sean is 18, he's in Pennsylvania, he's about to leave for his first year at BYU, and we start talking about religion. And I'm very confused now because Sean wants a relationship, an online relationship, but we talk about meeting in person. He wants a relationship with me. He says I'm a Christian. He affirms that I'm a Christian, but he's Mormon and he's trying to convert me to Mormonism. And I don't understand. I'm like, okay, my dad's Baptist, my mom was Nazarene. They don't care. They got along. We're both Christians. What is the issue here? But Sean kind of began trying to convert me. So I began reaching out to Mormons at high school and connecting with Mormons in high school and learning about the LDS church. And there was this group that I began spending time with. I'm going to call them the Harrises. And I just thought they were idyllic and perfect. You know, the dad and the mom, they loved each other. They had family home evening. They just seemed so wholesome and good. And I wound up taking the missionary discussions through them, but I didn't really want to join the church. Like, I was very clear from the beginning, I'm just learning about you guys. I like my church. You really can't get somebody to convert if they're not at least a little bit dissatisfied with their religion. And I loved my church. Sumner Presbyterian, I loved them so much. So I just wanted to learn about the Mormons, and that was kind of weird for them. But the thing was, so this was 1998 to 1999, and there really wasn't. So how wide the divide? This book, this had come out in 1997. Craig Blomberg, professor at Denver Seminary, and Stephen Robinson, professor at BYU Religion Department, this had come out, and this was kind of groundbreaking, because if you were evangelical and you were learning about Mormons, it was countercult stuff. It was Walter Martin or you were Mormon, right? And when I was 17 years old, my aunt, the Nazarene who became Presbyterian, my aunt gave me this for my birthday. This was 1999, January 1999, Is the Mormon My Brother by James R. White. And I was kind of caught up in the countercult for a while because there really wasn't a third way. Carl Mosher and Paul Owen, they published a paper in the Trinity Journal that year called Mormon Scholarship, Apologetics, and Evangelical Neglect, Losing the Battle, Not Knowing It. And then later they published a book called The New Mormon Challenge with Frank Beckwith as another editor. Yeah, I think you've got that one handy. I've got that one on ebook now. I've been converting my collection to ebooks, but this is still the book that my aunt gave me. But one of the things that was challenging was countercult literature is not very good. I mean, Mosher and Owen were correct. There's just like anything with the countercult that you can pick up. There's like a 60-page essay by some guy at Farms refuting it. So, and people in the countercult, maybe they have an MDiv or a bachelor's degree. You know, most of them are not super scholarly or academic. James White kind of was. But then there was a big scandal with his PhD. Around this time, a Mormon apologist named Gary Novak had done an expose on James White's PhD showing, I mean, White had admitted that it was unaccredited, but Novak kind of showed that White didn't do anywhere near the work that an accredited PhD would do. So this is hard to me as a teenager. I'm trying to use this material and engage with Mormons, and Mormons are like, oh, Dr. White? You know, and this has actually been a scandal with evangelicals. Walter Martin didn't have a PhD. Ed Decker, I've got the Godmakers here too, somewhere I picked this up. Ed Decker cites several people in his documentary. He calls them doctors. They all had unaccredited or fake PhDs too. So this was like a cottage industry in evangelicalism,
Yep.
with evangelicals engaging Mormonism with a fake or unaccredited PhD. Yep. And by the way, I know that James White years ago, it was reported that he's now working on an accredited PhD out of South Africa. I don't know what the status of that is. But anyway, it was just kind of embarrassing and hard for me as an evangelical. I'm trying to engage the Mormons. The countercult literature is not up to snuff. I don't know what to do. There's not a third way. And I started feeling kind of called to get good credentials. And I think somewhere along the line, I thought, well, what if I went to BYU? Like, they can't say I have bad credentials then. So this is my journal entry for, well, I picked up this journal in Utah. The Harrises took me to Utah in August 1999, and I fell in love, and I'm still in love with Utah. I tell my husband, he wants to retire to New York. I'm like, well, you're getting me a condo in Utah. I'm going to Utah when I want, okay? But Tuesday, this entry is dated Tuesday, September 21st, 1999. I was 17 years old. I said, I want to be firmly rooted in the truth. It's what I desire, and I long for it. I know that God is calling me to Provo and that he's going to provide a way. Even now, he's carving a path for me to take. I don't know why he wants me there. He didn't say why he wanted me there. He just said to go. I don't know if asking questions will do any good. There is such a tremendous work for me to do to be part of the bridge being built to LDS scholarship. There's so much to read and to write and to study. So maybe a little pretentious, but again, I'm an angsty, hormonal 17-year-old, and this is how I feel, that God is calling me there, that this is not the way, that the counter cult is not the way, that there has to be a third way to this. And I remember I read C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength. There's this part where one of the characters said, what if the whole universe is crooked and distorted? And is that any reason to join them? And I was like, you know what? I don't care if this is how evangelicals engage Mormons. I'm going to try something different. So I think that things were already being started by Moshe and Owen and by Blomberg, but there wasn't a lot. This was the beginning. Another entry that I wrote. I've been working on my application for BYU. God is with me. I was going to apply to Pacific Lutheran University, that was right down the street from me, as a backup plan, but now I'm not going to. God told me not to. He said that if I applied to Pacific Lutheran University, I was showing that I didn't have enough faith in him. I feel like I'm burning all of my other ships. My life is there in BYU. There is nothing for me here. I can think of a million reasons why I could fail at this, but here's the reason I'm going to succeed. God is with me. And that was November 1st, 1999. So I had this very deep sense of calling and this very deep sense that I was only supposed to go to BYU. So Sean and I did break up. He told me he absolutely could never get married to a non-Mormon. I told him, well, what have you been doing? I never said I was going to join the church. And we did break up, if you want to call it that. Like, our online relationship ended. But that
even after knowing that you were going to go to BYU?
Even after knowing that I was going to go to BYU. Now, he did sometimes have romantic feelings for me. Pretty consistently after this, I think I shot him down. Okay. But I'll come back to Sean later on. We did remain friends, but Sean and I were never romantic again. And so here's the thing, though. So I told everyone, my youth pastors did not want me to go to BYU. They said, you're going to marry a Mormon and convert. And in fairness to them, one of those things happened and the second one almost happened. So I think there was some wisdom there, but I think they had a good handle on me and my loneliness and my insecurities and my problems with my family. And I think they knew that this was dangerous for me. So they did not want me to go there. They encouraged me to go to a Christian college, and it was probably good advice. I did not get into BYU. So it was the only college I applied to. And in January, I think toward the end of January, the year 2000, I got a letter from them telling me that I didn't get in. And I was devastated because it's like, am I not listening to God? Did I not read God right? And it sent me an invitation to the spring and summer programs there, which are, BYU has 2 summer terms. If you don't know BYU, they have a fall term and a winter term, and then 2 summer terms. Usually a college will have fall, spring, and 1 summer, but BYU actually does 2 summers. So they're a little different. They call their spring term winter term. They said I could come for spring and summer, but I couldn't be a student there. I could be a visiting student. So I was devastated. I thought, did I read you wrong, God? So I started going to seminary, LDS seminary, to try to boost my resume with them. I kept working hard on my grades and on my AP tests. And I talked to someone. I wrote a letter to them. I write very, very well. And I talked to someone in BYU administration. And they basically said, we don't usually do this, but we'll let you reapply for winter semester. This guy called me. He said, forget about fall. That's gone. We're going to let you reapply for winter, though. So keep getting good grades, go to seminary, do good on those tests, and we'll reevaluate this. So July 12th, I got my AP test scores. I got an 8, I 5 on one of them and a 4 on the other one, good scores. And I called BYU to find out if they had all my materials, and they told me, this was July 12th, 2000. They told me that I got in. And I said, so I called BYU. The woman told me they had received my transcript and they had made a decision. So fast, I asked. She said they just made it today and the letter would be sent out tomorrow. I asked her if she knew what the decision was, and she said, I do, you've been accepted. She kind of teased me about, I was like, are you sure? So I was just like overwhelmed and overjoyed. Like I felt like maybe I hadn't read God wrong. Maybe I was just taking a different path there. So that was how I decided to go to BYU.
You know what's so fascinating, Bridget, is that when I hear you tell your story, I can so see why Mormonism and so many of us would resonate with you. You're doing journaling.
Oh yeah.
You're doing so many of the things that LDS people would be doing. So it seems like the culture of Mormonism is a pretty nice fit for you.
It
Just
really
so far, what
resonated.
you're saying.
And my Mormon friends are going to recognize this journal because they sell them in the visitor center in Salt Lake City. I picked up this exact journal and then my later one. These are like from the visitor center in Salt Lake City. They sell, this is like a company in Utah that sells this standard journal. So this is a Mormon journal I was writing in, basically. But yeah, January 4th, 2001, here I am at Brigham Young University. Though my worries are many, Lord, still I live in peace. Be with me tomorrow, Father, as I try to get things done. I love you, Lord. I thank you for Sumner Presbyterian. I thank you for Provo. And I thank you, I thank you, I thank you. So yeah, it was a tough journey there. And but I got there. It was kind of roundabout. And I really felt so much that God had called me there and that I was supposed to be there. Once I got there, though, I kind of had to decide where I was going to go to church. I don't know. Were there any other questions about my background or how I came to know Mormons that you wanted to know?
You know, you did experience childhood trauma growing
Yes,
up in this too, and of course you
I've
allude
worked
to
through
that.
it.
Yeah, so you had a rough upbringing. Your aunt played a role in you converting. You would, in your mind, converting to Christianity would be there. And what role did you, when you're in this tumultuous thing where you have parents who are Christian and they're abusive, and you're a Christian, and how did your faith help you during that time?
That was actually incredible. So I had a day, to be clear, my mom was abusive when she was younger, when she drank a lot, but she was a much different person when she was older. And I
Okay.
had a much closer relationship to her when she was older. She had a reading disorder. She was dyslexic, and she never felt like she could really, she knew that her daughter was intelligent, and she never really felt like she could connect to me per se, but she sympathized with me. So one day my dad was being the way he was, blaming me for everything. And we got into a big, because I'm so stubborn and I like to argue. I love to argue. So he would blame me for things. And I was like, no, it's not my fault. It's your fault. And I would just argue with them. So she put me in the car. She was like, come with me. She puts me in the car and she's driving. And I'm like, I realized where she's going. And I said, Mom, why are we driving to Sumner Presbyterian Church? And she said, I'm going to have your leaders talk to you. So they talked to me about my dad's abuse. And, you know, I told them my frustrations, that he's always blaming me for everything, that we're always getting into fights because he'll come home from work and everything's my fault. And then I will engage him. And they basically taught me something. They didn't call it this, but it's called gray rock. Okay. When you're dealing with a toxic personality or an abusive person, you are boring like a rock. You don't engage, you don't fight them, you just say, okay. So they taught me that when my dad comes home and he wants to blame me for things and he wants to put everything on me, just say, okay, Dad, don't fight with him. We know that he's wrong. We know that he's blaming you for things that he shouldn't. Just say, okay, Dad. If he wants to say you did this and this and this, just say, okay, Dad, I'm sorry, Dad. So I guess in a way I became submissive, but I became boring and I stopped engaging him. And it was because my leaders knew my situation and they knew they couldn't get me out of that. But they did teach me how to survive that.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
sorry.
No, it's okay.
So,
Yeah. No, I understand. I understand completely what it's like to go through what you went through, because I had
yeah.
similar situation with a toxic father, and
So Sumner Presbyterian was so important to me though. And this is why it was so hard for the Mormons to separate me from it.
okay.
And
See,
I actually wrote about Sumner Presbyterian my first year at BYU that won a contest.
yeah.
So we'll cover that.
Yeah.
But
Well, that's interesting.
they
Well,
were my heart and they helped me survive the end of this difficult childhood. So
okay. Well, that's great, and so they played a pivotal role in really
absolutely.
helping changing the trajectory of your life and how you related to your father, and I'm sure they gave you some tools to
Oh, for
also help
sure.
you function in this new world that you're going to in Provo.
And like I said, you cannot get somebody to leave their religion when they're happy with their religion.
That's
And I
right.
was so happy with Sumner Presbyterian. And
Yep.
one more point about my upbringing, though, like I mentioned, my aunt was an elder. Now, I wouldn't say I was feminist at the time, but I guess I was nominally moving in what's called an egalitarian direction. Like I really didn't know the issues at the time, but I was moving into there's different camps in evangelicalism. There's women cannot preach, cannot be elders, cannot be pastors, and men lead in the home. And there's mutuality in the home, and women can be pastors, elders, or deacons, and there's different levels. Some churches, women can be deacons, but not pastors and elders. There's different levels, but I was moving in this direction of women can be anything. I was very inspired. My leaders at Sumner Presbyterian taught me about Deborah in Judges 4, who was a prophet. So later when I encountered Mormonism, and Mormons are like, oh, it's okay. Well, I'll tell you this. When I encountered Mormonism, I originally thought they sounded wonderful, like prophets and apostles and elders and deacons. I thought it sounded wonderful. And the blessings of healing and anointing and the laying on of hands, I thought that all sounded wonderful. But when I found out I'd never get to do any of that because I was a woman, it was kind of like finding out that there really is a Santa Claus, but he only gives presents to boys. So I don't know. I came from this church where women were respected and were given important roles and could do anything. And the Mormons pretty much just kept patting me on the head and saying, it's okay, you can have babies. So I kind of shelved this for my time at BYU, actually, and feminist issues did not come up a lot for me at BYU. I just kind of decided, and I would engage them. I actually wrote to Sherry Aldu when I was a teenager, and she wrote me back. And I kind of had confronted her about prophets in the Bible, female prophets in the Bible, and why don't have Mormons have female prophets, things like that. But it was a point of difference for me and my LDS friends, but it was just one that I kind of shelved. I finally decided, you know what, I'm not joining the LDS church, not my circus, not my monkeys, if you guys want to treat women this way. So, but it was always a difference between us.
So you then go to BYU and you decide you go church hunting. You decided you wanted to find a church shopping, we'll call it. And so
Yeah,
maybe talk a little bit about your experiences looking for a church that would suit you for your situation.
I kind of had it picked out before I got there, but here's the thing about being non-Mormon in Provo, at least this is the way it was at the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s. I mean, there's not a lot of non-LDS church. There's an EV Free in Orem that's pretty big, and I'm sure they're still around. And most of the churches in that area, though, they've got less than 50 people, some of them less than 10 or 20 people. They're very tiny, and they do love to have BYU students. I think the Catholic Church has a lot of people, but most of the Protestant churches are tiny. But there had been a feature in Christianity Today. Here, I've got the article. It was called A Peacemaker in Provo. I think this was February or April 2000. Christianity Today ran a feature article about this congregation in Utah. in Provo, how one Pentecostal pastor taught his congregation to love Mormons. And it was the story of how this church had felt like the countercult and the antagonism with the LDS church was not the way forward, and that they needed to kind of repent and treat Mormons better. So they drafted something called the Declaration of Repentance, saying, we have not treated Mormons very well. We're done with this countercult stuff. We've not treated Mormons well. We're choosing a different way. So as God was moving me to choose a different way, God's moving these other people to choose a different way. And even though I was Presbyterian, whatever, I was like, I want to go hang out with the Pentecostals when I get to BYU. And it wasn't a great fit because I do not speak in tongues. They never did that at this church. I don't speak in tongues. And in order to join the Assemblies of God, it's actually in their beliefs that you have to speak in tongues. So when I came out there, I talked with Pastor Dean and Marlis, his wife, about joining the Assemblies of God. And they were just kind of like, we're just going to overlook that not speaking in tongues thing. So even though I joined the Assembly of God and the Pentecostals, there were things I liked there, but also it's weird for me now to read my journals and see people referring to me as Pentecostal because I don't know, Pentecostalism is not known for its intellectualism. So I guess I was going to a Pentecostal church, but I was a very bad Pentecostal, I guess you could say. But that was where I went to church. And there was something that my pastor said at one point that I wanted to read. He was a very wise man. He was a very wise man. And at one point, he talked to us about why we do things the way that we do. Dean. And okay, here's what I wrote. This is skipping ahead a little bit. April 14th, 2002. Pastor Dean made a really good point this morning. He asked us how we would feel if, when we got out of church this morning, there was a group of LDS missionaries standing on the sidewalk asking us if we'd like to hear the truth now. They wouldn't even be putting out Books of Mormon or anti-Protestant literature or anything. They'd just be asking us politely if we'd like to hear the truth. I mean, we would be super offended if somebody actually did that. I mean, I said, I don't know about other people, but I'd be angry if somebody did that. Nothing would feel better than throwing a rock at those missionaries. I mean, being by our property while we're trying to hold a worship service and then telling us to listen to the truth. A complete affront to our desire for peaceful worship, completely disrespectful. I'd be angry. And this is why we don't do things like the countercult does, standing outside of General Conference, holding signs, or standing outside of LDS wards, holding signs. Like, ideologically, sometimes you guys may be correct, and I understand you want to save Mormons, but it's disrespectful. There's a time and a place to engage with Mormons, and I don't agree with standing outside of their worship services and their places of meeting. That's why we don't do like the countercult does. But Dean was a very wise man, and there was a copy of the Declaration of Repentance that was actually on display in the BYU Religion Building, I think the Joseph Smith Building, the Vatican, as they call it. It was on display there, though. So I was plugged in to a church that had a pretty good relationship with the LDS church overall, pretty friendly relationship. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was the perfect place for you to attend for as a student. I mean, because I imagine that it probably helped with your credibility too, as a student, that you weren't there to be the person with the blowhorn with the signs and trying to convert people. You were there to have a real genuine interactions. And I want to ask you about this pastor of the Assemblies of God Church. What made him decide? Like, was there a time when he was a countercult guy, and then did he originally come to Utah because he wanted to convert Mormons, and he had kind of an epiphany of what they're doing wrong, and what caused him to even come up with that declaration? Do you have any recollection on that?
I mean, I'll post the link to the article in the comments, but here's the beginning of the article. Dean Jackson recalls his childhood days of traveling with his missionary parents to donor churches during furlough. Night after night, my father would describe our ministry in Japan, and then at the end of the service, I'd watch people shaking his hand. This was the late 60s, and beefy veterans of World War II would come up and say, well, Brother Jackson, I suppose it's a good thing that somebody goes and tells them dirty Japs about the Lord. If I heard that phrase once growing up, I must have heard it 50 times. The young Jackson was hard-pressed to reconcile the comments of those American Christians with the world he knew in the Far East. I met a lot of wonderful people, he said, but I never met a dirty Jap. The Jacksons made friends with neighbors, business people, and civic leaders, Buddhists and Christians alike, finding them most often to be gracious and intelligent. In time, Jackson followed his father's footsteps into the Assemblies of God ministry. It talks about his background and how he wound up pastoring in Provo. I didn't print out the whole article, but he basically just kind of, he said one day his son was riding a bus, and somebody said to his son, one of the other kids said to his son, those people, they drove by they saw the cross, and he said, my daddy says those people with the cross on their building, that they lie. And his wife was ready to burn down half Provo. But he was like, no, we need to talk to them. We need to be in conversation with them. But there were similar comments, people would, sometimes when you're a non-Mormon in this environment, you get into a place where you kind of want to vent and you want to talk about how frustrating the Mormons are, or the persecution complex. There's or other things that kind of go on in the LDS culture, and it can feel like making fun of them, and there can be people making unkind comments about them. So he felt like that was going on at his church, that just like the dirty Japs comment, people were kind of coming in and making comments to the effect of those dirty Mormons. And that kind of pricked his conscience. And so he did this thing where he called his congregation to repentance. And yes, people left the church over it, and the church shrank, but other people came, and Mormons felt better about visiting. So in my time at BYU, I did bring quite a few Mormons to Rock Canyon Assembly of God, which is not around anymore, Rock Canyon Assembly of God. And at one point there was a religion class I took. It was American Christianity, and the man who taught it, Roger Keller, I don't know if you've heard of him. He was Presbyterian, and he was a Presbyterian pastor, and then he became a Mormon bishop. So he kind of had this interfaith background. And for this class that you were required to visit 3 churches, not your own, and write like a 2 or 3 page paper on them. So a whole bunch of people in this class came to church with me as one of their assignments to visit my church. And over time, roommates came, friends from my ward came. I definitely brought a lot of different Mormons to church. The other church I had a lot of interaction with, though, was Orem EV Free. I sometimes went out there. I went to their college youth group because they were bigger and they had more resources, and that was where most of the BYU students attended. I don't know if they're still around. I don't keep in touch with them, but Pastor Scott McKinney was the pastor. I don't know if he still is, and he was quite involved on campus, and he had always been involved on campus. So these were kind of my church homes of where I was involved.
Okay. So now let's talk about you as a student at BYU. How did you engage that world as a Christian? Did you wear a cross? Did you, I know Leah likes to wear a cross on campus, those kind of things. Yeah. How did you kind of make your statement and present yourself, I guess is the best way to say it?
Initially I wore crosses, and I found kind of a funny phenomenon. Like, people were never offended by the crosses, but I would see other people wearing crosses, and I would sometimes say, hey, are you LDS? And they always were. Like, I don't think I ever found a fellow Protestant by looking for crosses. Some of them just had, like, it was a family heirloom, or maybe they had other reasons for it. But I actually saw not tons of Mormons, but once in a while I'd see someone wearing a cross, and I learned it was a bad idea to ask them if they were a member of the church. So for a while I wore crosses. I think later I switched it to a fish. It was like a little necklace I had with a fish on it and a little dog tag on it with a scripture verse on it. So I would wear that sometimes. I had a What Would Jesus Do bracelet, which, by the way, I've seen 2 kids in like Wendy's checkout and Mariano's checkout lately wearing What Would Jesus Do bracelets. So
I'm friends with Mormon missionaries here in Tampa, and they're wearing What Would Jesus Do bracelets now.
Yeah, I guess they're making a comeback. I'm wearing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu bracelets. That's my new What Would Jesus Do? Who would Jesus tap? No, I don't wear a What Would Jesus Do bracelet anymore, but I still wear something for my faith. I guess maybe I'll talk about that. But initially I tried to stand out, and I would wear like Christian t-shirts and things that would get people asking questions. I did have an I Love Jesus lanyard, and they actually talked about this later in the Daily Universe when they interviewed me. But I did stop wearing the crosses eventually. It just didn't seem distinctive enough, actually. It seemed like there were enough Mormons wearing them that nobody thought I was not LDS from wearing them. So I felt like the fish was a better conversation starter. So, Mormons obviously have their own jewelry and paraphernalia. Hold to the rod necklaces were popular back then. I don't know if they still are. Choose the right.
Yeah.
I learned a big difference in LDS culture. Okay, so I actually had a promise ring because I was very much a product of the Josh Harris movement, the I Kiss Dating Goodbye movement, the
Yeah.
purity culture movement, the Boy Meets World. And I know that's all gone downhill. And now we have these grown evangelicals talking about how this movement traumatized them. But the purity ring was the promise of saving sex till marriage. But when Mormons would ask, I'd say, oh, that's a promise ring. And they're like, well, who's it for? And I'm like, for God? Like, I didn't realize that promise ring in Mormon culture is usually I'm waiting for a missionary or something like that. So I didn't realize there was a completely different definition of promise ring. But I would wear my purity ring sometimes. I know it's a little embarrassing now, but I would wear my purity ring. It was given to me by my youth leaders at Sumner Presbyterian, and it made me think of them. So that's a little weird, but and I would wear a fish sometimes. What I did love was Christian bands, and there is no equivalent for this in Mormonism. I was really into the Christian music scene. I loved the Supertones. I loved Jennifer Knapp. I loved Five Iron Frenzy was like my jam. I actually saw them in concert in Provo once, and I brought my Mormon roommate. It was fun. But I would often wear my Christian band shirts, the Newsboys, Stephen Curtis Chapman, DC Talk. And it was really odd because there's no equivalent of that in Mormonism. I only recently learned that that's because the Jesus movement, the movie, and how the Jesus movement transformed evangelical worship. And there was no equivalent in the LDS church. They didn't start using contemporary music in their worship services. But anyway, now that I'm a little older, I still like some of these bands. Caveman's Call, Jennifer Knapp, DC Talk. There's certain bands I'll still listen to it, but a lot of it I listen to it, but it's like, this really isn't very good. So thank you to everyone at BYU who put up with my bad Christian music that I made you listen to. Thank you for your eternal patience with me. I just want to say that. But those were some of the ways that I engage. I don't play guitar well, but I play it very badly, and I would sometimes play evangelical worship music. For a couple classes, they actually let me play a song in class. So,
Wow.
But don't ask me to play guitar. You only need to know like 7 chords to play evangelical worship music. So if you want to be in an evangelical worship band, it's going to take a day, but you can do it. The same 7 chords that will get you most evangelical worship music.
So, while you're there, you're attending classes. You attend the religion classes. Just talk about your experience as a student at BYU, the actual class setting.
Okay, let me talk about the religion classes first.
Let's do that.
So these have changed a little bit over time. At the time, so everybody has to take 14 credits of religion. And at the time, what was required, if you were a freshman there and you were doing your entire degree there, you had to do 2 Book of Mormon classes, a Doctrine and Covenants class, a New Testament class, and then the other 6 credits were electives. But if you were a non-Mormon, you could take a class called Intro to Mormonism, and that could count for either Book of Mormon or Doctrine and Covenants. Not only that, but they offered non-Mormon Book of Mormon for like the athletes, and it was like easy mode. It was like super easy. So I was kind of a weirdo. The very first class, since I was coming winter semester, but I was a freshman and I had no standing, all the Book of Mormon classes were full. So the very first class I signed up for was Pearl of Great Price. And it was kind of strange. I'll say one of the reasons I came to BYU was because I honestly wanted to learn LDS apologetics. I wanted to hear the best Mormonism had to offer. I wanted to learn LDS apologetics. I remember I interviewed Dan Peterson my very first semester there. I interviewed him about LDS apologetics. I probably have the tape somewhere, but I wrote a paper for one of classes about him and LDS apologetics. But I wanted to learn. I wanted to hear these things. I wanted to hear the evidences for the Book of Mormon. I wanted to hear the best that they had to offer. And it was kind of weird because they didn't really talk about it very much. I did this Pearl of Great Price class, and one of the textbooks was John Gee's A Guide to the Book of Abraham Papyrus. And so I thought, oh, good, I want to hear their apologetic for this because this seems pretty bad for them. I want to hear their apologetic for the Book of Abraham. The teacher didn't cover it. He was like, okay, you have John Gee's book, read it on your own. And it was never covered in class. The class was all about the devotional application of the Book of Abraham. So it was a weird place to jump in. I did a Book of Mormon class next, and I grew very frustrated with that because I wanted to learn again evidences and scholarship for the Book of Mormon, and I felt like it was all rote memorization. And they seemed to expect that you had studied this very carefully growing up. I mean, it was a hell, but it wasn't hell where I was learning very much. So I got frustrated with the Book of Mormon class, and the next semester for my second half of the Book of Mormon, I signed up for the non-Mormon Book of Mormon. I didn't learn anything there. That was easy mode. That was like high school. Let's copy the smart girls paper, you know, like the tests were all easy. It was really just something so that the athletes could rubber stamp their Book of Mormon requirements.
I see.
So
Okay.
I kind of kept my head down and just wanted to get the religion over with at that point. I did the Doctrine and Covenants through a local seminary, like institute, but I will say I enjoyed the temples class. I did a class on temples. It was a one credit class, so I actually did 15 credits, not 14. And I enjoyed the temples class. I enjoyed what I was learning there. I remember the teacher asked a question though about, the answer was Joseph F. Smith, and I wrote Joseph Fielding Smith because that was his name. And I was shocked when the teacher marked it wrong, and I'm like, you know, the hell. And it's because Mormons actually distinguish between Joseph F. Smith with the initial and Joseph Fielding Smith, even though technically they're both named Joseph Fielding Smith. But I did mean the earlier one. I just didn't know about this distinction. So I remember I argued with the professor and he changed it for me. But I was like, how would a non-Mormon know that you guys, Mormons and their initials, they're like super weird about their initials sometimes. So, but other than that, the classes I took were the Christianity classes. I took like a general church history class, and then I took the American church history class, and those were actually good experiences. And I feel like the professors there were very respectful and had a very good positive attitude towards other forms of Christianity, towards Protestantism, towards Catholicism, and were very respectful, and those were good experiences. So, but I do know that the religion curriculum at BYU has changed, and now I think instead of 2 Book of Mormon, there's like a general Book of Mormon class, and I hope it's changed for the better, but I don't know anything. I would say though that if you're a non-Mormon and you want to go to BYU, if you plan to transfer out, don't bother with the religion classes. Later on, when I left BYU and I was shopping for evangelical seminaries, these classes weren't good for anything. Nobody would give me credit for anything other than general elective credit. They didn't give me biblical studies credit for the BYU religion classes, partially because it's BYU, but yeah, it's just not considered rigorous by other Christian colleges. So you know, you're basically asked to do a minor in the Mormon religion, and I wouldn't bother with that if you plan to transfer out or if you're just a visiting student. I think I would skip the BYU religion classes, but they do have excellent teachers. There are some good people in the BYU religion department, as I will get into. Other classes though, so this was wild. Okay, my very first class, 8 a.m., Hebrew 101, modern Hebrew. And the teacher was very young and very pretty, and she's teaching us modern Hebrew. And I was good friends with the guy in the class. The teacher's name was Rivka, and I'm going to call the guy Mordecai. And we were such good friends, me and Mordecai. And I wrote this funny little skit mid-semester about how he was marrying Rivka and going to Las Vegas, right? And Rivka, towards the end of class, kept talking about this guy she was dating. And towards the end of class, she's like complaining about this guy. And we're like, Rivka, you want us to go and have a talk with this guy that's pissing you off, you know? I didn't know. Like the last day of class, she said she was engaged. And we're like, okay, who is it? And Mordecai stands up and says, it's me. And I'm like, you were dating your student? And yeah, they met in the class, and I guess the Hebrew department had said it's okay if they date, but it's kind of weird to me in our post-Me Too world. Like, even as a student teacher, I don't think that would have flown in most places today. I think they would have said he needs to not be your student before you date him, but they met each other in that class, they dated, and they got engaged in a single semester. And I thought this was wild. It was like, Mormons date their students? You know, maybe that's a misrepresentation, but Rivka and Mordecai both became very good friends to me, and I had many positive interactions with them. But when I wrote my skit, she knew that I was friends with Mordecai, and she was like, did you tell her? Did you tell her? He's like, I didn't tell her anything. I just have a sense about people. I did think they'd be a cute couple, but I didn't think they'd date when he was her student. But anyway, I had a really great experience with Kylie Turley. She's a writing teacher there. She really encouraged my writing. But I'll talk about the writing contest in a little bit. But she loved my writing, and she humored my Christian music. So just a great experience with Kylie. There was a woman there named Julie Parker. She was Stephen Robinson. She was Stephen Robinson's TA, I think.
Okay.
And her father, Todd Parker, was a professor in religion there. But Julie and I became very good friends. And later on, she became my maid of honor at my wedding. And just very good friends. My journals are full of references to Julie. And Julie, I was in a class with a guy named Nick Frederick. I can't remember. I think I was in the class where Nick and Julie met. But Julie married Nick, and us three were always having conversations and discussions. One thing about Julie was there was a professor named Dr. Huntsman. I'll cover him in a bit, but he allowed me and Julie to have a debate. Okay, so there was a Mormon prophet, I think it was Spencer W. Kimball. You know how Mormons can be kind of perfectionists about their leaders. Spencer Kimball, I think, said Peter did not deny Christ. Christ commanded him to deny him for self-preservation. When he said, "You will deny me," that was not a prediction, it was a commandment. In at least two of the Gospels, I think, there's a way you can structure the Greek so you can argue that it's adjussive, basically. I think two of the others, it's harder to do that. My memory of this is very old. But I remember at one point, Eric Huntsman let me and Julie have a debate in class. And I think I'm not going to read all the notes, but I think I took careful notes on the debate. Took careful notes on the debate and what we each argued and how that went. It was pretty cool, though, that we were able to have like this pro and con debate on kind of a very respectful debate on interfaith issues, and whether or not Jesus commanded Peter to deny him or not. So I took the position that no, this was something Jesus predicted, not something that he commanded him. But you kind of see that tendency towards the inerrancy of leaders, though, in this debate. The old saying is that the Pope is infallible, but nobody really believes it. The Mormon prophet is not infallible, but the Mormons don't believe that. There's kind of this tendency to not want the leaders to screw up. But a significant person for me, though, is a man that I'm going to call Dr. Young. That's not his real name. And I took Greek 101 with him my second semester at BYU. I took more classes with him than anyone else. And like a lot of women, in the movie Kill Bill, the bride mentions that Bill, who didn't have a father figure, collected father figures. That's kind of the way I was. I was like Bill. I collected father figures. I was always on the lookout for my next father figure.
Okay.
And Dr. Young was something of a father figure to me. And I think he was probably 5'3" and I was 6 feet tall. And he never said anything about me being freakishly tall. And I never said anything about him being short. It was like a truce between us. And I don't know why he took a shining to me, because God knows I'm not a feminist. I think it's because I'm funny and I speak out a lot. And I don't know, he liked me. I was like a favorite student. He once was just demonstrating the vocative and he called me favorite student in the Greek vocative. So we were very close, though. I was later his research assistant. And I did some work. I was actually employed through the BYU religion department. I did work for him on the Gospel of John, but I took more classes with him than anyone else. He could be really difficult though. Like, he was Ivy League educated. He was stubborn. He'd be very, very wrong sometimes, but he just wouldn't let it go, and he could be temperamental. So you just kind of tiptoed around him sometimes, but I was so fond of him. And later on, when I did get married, I gave him the third dance at my wedding after my husband and my father. So that was me kind of saying, you are a father to me. You're as close as I can put you without this looking weird. And I do have pictures on Facebook of us dancing at my wedding. But years later, after I left BYU, I found out that I guess Hugh Nibley died in 2005. Dr. Young was a student of Hugh Nibley's, was very close to Hugh Nibley. And Hugh Nibley died in 2005. And I don't know if the administration will be happy with me for talking about this, but I feel like it's probably time that we created space to talk about this. Dr. Young started recruiting students into like an offshoot of Mormonism. What I heard, and I have not heard directly from one of his victims, my information is secondhand. But what I heard was that he was teaching that the Mormon church was in apostasy. He was teaching that an angelic visitor had visited him when he was young, and the Mormon church was in apostasy, and there were people who were recruited to restore it. And I think there was a polygamy aspect to this. And like I said, he was a very respected professor at BYU. And yeah, I guess he was kind of recruiting or coercing students into joining kind of this offshoot of Mormonism that he was secretly teaching, teaching that the LDS Church was an apostasy and that Hugh Nibley was some kind of angelic figure. Anyway, there were like 7 scions. It was weirdness, and I don't know how accurate. I trust my source, and I've talked to enough people at BYU who said yes, something to this effect happened, but
And you never saw any of this as a student. You were
no.
probably completely. What do you think happened? Did he have a mental breakdown, or do you think he always felt this way? And then when Hugh Nibley died, for whatever reason, he felt like this was the time that he was supposed to start telling this. I mean, what do you think was going on there?
Well, I think he was always eccentric and in love with his own correctness. But the thing with Mormonism is back in the 1800s, when the US government was trying to eradicate polygamy, a lot of LDS prophets basically said a polygamy is never ever going away. They made very strong statements to the effect of polygamy is never ever going away. And then the US government made it pretty clear that they were going to dismantle the LDS church legally and or illegally if you listen to Mormons, but so they did the 1890 proclamation and said, we're done, like,
Mhm.
but they were still practicing polygamy. Several of the 12 apostles took plural wives after the 1890 proclamation. So then I think it was in 1904 or 1905, I can't remember the year, there was a second proclamation. They said, okay, for real, we're going to stop with this polygamy stuff. But the problem for Mormonism is there's always somebody who goes back and reads those fundamentalist things and says, hey, we weren't supposed to quit polygamy. And, they'll conclude that the church is in apostasy or partial apostasy this direction. I know that he later had an association with Denver Snuffer too, which I thought he was ambivalent on polygamy. But
Yeah. Yeah.
I never saw this firsthand. He was never inappropriate with me. I don't think he was recruiting women into this cult. I don't know. It was very shocking to me though, because like I said, I took more classes with him than anybody else, and he was like a father to me. Third dance at my wedding after my dad. I was
Wow.
very close to him, and it was just shocking to me to hear this years later. So, and I do have another story or two about him because again, we were very close. But yeah, that's kind of what classes were like.
Hmm.
Um,
That's fascinating. And it, just to think that, yeah, you're right about, I because I'm friends with a lot of polygamists, and
mhm.
I've engaged. Of course, I'm friends with Denver Snuffer as well, but a lot of
Okay,
these people that
you'll
you
have to
talk
ask
about.
Snuffer about Dr. Young. I'm sure he'll know who I'm talking about.
Okay, yeah, I'll talk to him about that because it's really interesting. But yeah, there is this whole polygamy thing. Really is the one of the legacies of the church that is still the repercussions of that still echo to this day. Whether we see it with now this growing anti or that Joseph didn't practice polygamy movement now that's gaining
Yeah,
some steam. So they're trying
and then
to,
oh,
and
go
then
ahead.
well, and then you just also then have other people who on their own do studies of church history, or maybe they even like to say, like, sometimes when you get groups of LDS folk together in a room doing like a study of the scriptures, often those people end up becoming polygamists. And so
Yeah,
you just when they're doing their own independent thing, so you just have this that happening is a uniquely uh LDS situation where you'd have a professor doing this, right? So
yeah.
so no matter what, in one sense, polygamy is an eternal principle because it
Hmm.
hasn't been able to be snuffed out, even
They
though the
really
church
can't get away from it.
can't get
No.
away from it. It's part of their legacy, and they have to own that.
Yeah. I someday I'm going to write an essay called "Can Grace Save Mormonism?" where I'm going to try to give them a theological tool where I think they could leave some of this stuff behind. I got to write that essay because I think I have a good idea on this, but it's going to have to wait.
Oh, I'm interested about that. Okay, wow.
Okay. But I feel like maybe if they approach this from the framework of this was a mistake, but there was truth within it. Because right now they try to approach it from the framework of God commanded this. It's weird, but God commanded it. And we don't know why. But what if they said it really was a screw up and it really was Joseph Smith being selfish and to some extent fallen, but there was truth in it, which was eternal marriage. It bore truth with it. So
Mm.
just kind of the synthesis of grace, that something problematic and difficult happened, but truth came out of that, you know?
Hmm.
I don't know. I think that you could perhaps make that argument. Maybe that would help them to leave polygamy behind and just a mistake, you know? But that maybe it requires more than the Mormons would ever be willing to make, but this is never far from them. Like, I think it just keeps happening again and again that somebody crops up. I talk to other people online. I had my own interactions with polygamists. I think I told you before that I actually have a revelation from a Mormon quasi-polygamous group that they gave me when I was a teenager. I've had my own interactions with them. It's just never very far from them.
No.
And I do talk to other evangelicals sometimes, like being at Trinity now, I'm pretty comfortable with polygamy. I actually just mentioned it in my sermon on Sunday, and it kind of skews the evangelicals out sometimes. It's never actually forbidden in the Bible. In my opinion, 1 Timothy 3 is not actually forbidding polygamy, where it says the husband of one wife, because later it says that ministering widows must be the wife of one husband. Well, what were they were they barring polyandry also? Like, no, this either meant married once or it meant be faithful to your spouse. But so I don't think the Bible ever actually says polygamy is wrong, but I do think most of the examples of polygamy in the Bible are destructive and caused a lot of grief and scorn. So if I were like I have a professor that just got back from Liberia, where I think polygamy is pretty common. Like, if I were a missionary in a country that was still practicing it, I wouldn't want converts to divorce their plural wives, but I definitely say don't take any more, no more.
Okay.
That would be
Yeah.
my position. But I'm probably a little more comfortable with polygamy than the average evangelical. I've made my peace with it. It doesn't skeeve me out when I come across with it.
It's funny because there was a lady who used to live here, because I live in a Christian community here in Florida. So there's a lot of retired missionaries that live here, and she was a missionary with John G. Lake, an organization that was started by John G. Lake, which was a famous Pentecostal minister from the early 20th century. And she was affiliated with this group, and she was good friends with one of King Goodwill. King Goodwill was the Zulu king, and he was a polygamist. And she was friends with one of his wives, who was a really on fire, spirit-filled Pentecostal woman, and she had no doubt this was legit. And so, to me, yeah, I'm a lot less. Actually, it's interesting, isn't it? I'm not. Yeah, I feel comfortable with the idea, because I don't think that the Bible does condemn it. In one sense, you could say the Book of Mormon is actually harder on polygamy than the Bible is.
It is harder
So,
on polygamy, 100%.
yeah. So if I were to preach against polygamy, I'd be using the Book of Mormon more than the Bible.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, it's never expressly condemned in the Bible. That's one of the ironies of the Book of Mormon. But yeah, I've known polygamists who are lovely people. I'm pretty comfortable with it. It's not something that I would agree with or practice myself, and like I said, I discourage it as a Christian, but I don't think it was ever condemned. I certainly think there's worse things than being a polygamist.
Ethical polygamy, where there's no child brides and it's consensual, to me is I don't have a problem with it.
Yeah, I understand that. Yep, that's pretty much, and legally, that's definitely my view. Like, I don't want to legalize polygamy, but if somebody, if he's got 4 wives and they're not hurting anybody, I don't want to arrest them, let them live their lives. That's the way I am about that. But one more thing about Dr. Young, though, I just want to say that I know that in case I'm upsetting anyone at the BYU administration, this has been an open secret for years now, but I know you guys had a really tough thing to deal with, a really tough situation to deal with. So I just want to encourage people to have sympathy and compassion for the administration and how they dealt with this. I believe he was kind of forced into retirement early. I don't know all the details, but yeah, they had a really difficult situation. He was a well-known and a respected professor. And, obviously this is embarrassing, but this stuff happens in Mormonism. And there's lovely people who believe some very strange or some very Mormon fundamentalist type things. So, yeah.
Well, this is quite an adventure that you're having here. So I'm just, this is one of the things that happens is you're supposed to go to BYU as a woman, find yourself a man, right? That's the whole point. Isn't that what they told you when you're supposed to get married as a student?
Oh, yeah, I'm going to get to that. I have many stories about that.
Yeah, because I thought we could chat about that too. So, but yeah.
Can I tell you about Eric Huntsman?
Oh yeah, talk about him, and then we're going to talk about your dating life.
Okay, let me talk about Eric Huntsman. Let me tell you a crazy incident or two that happened. So, Eric Huntsman was a real paradigm shift for me. Now, I can't tell his story. I talked to him before I came on here, and I can't tell the whole of his story. But when I came to BYU, my attitude towards Mormons was, you can be saved as a Mormon, but God will lead you out of the church.
Ah, okay. Yep.
If you've been Mormon your whole life and you're not leaving the church, you're not saved. It was kind of a counter cult attitude still. You're not saved. I didn't believe there was any such thing as a saved Mormon who stays in the church indefinitely and doesn't leave. Obviously, you can get saved in the Mormon church, but the Holy Spirit's going to lead you out. That was how I felt. And when I met Eric Huntsman, he had gone to Young Life as a teenager. He had had some experiences with Baptists, even though he'd been raised Mormon. And he just convinced me that he'd had the same kind of salvation experiences that I'd had. And I was completely floored. And he really became my ally. Like, I always called him the Evangelical Mormon. He really became my ally and somebody that I often talked to when I needed. He was my spiritual mentor. Dr. Young was my father figure, but Dr. Huntsman, Eric, I call him now.
Oh, okay.
Eric was my spiritual mentor in many ways when I was there. He was somebody that I could talk to about religion. He was somebody I felt safe with talking to about religion, not feeling like he wouldn't convert me. There were a couple of incidences that were kind of crazy, though. One was going back to Kylie Turley, my writing teacher. So I wrote 2 essays for her that she loved, and one was called The Gift of the Holy Ghost and Why Non-LDS Christians Have It. And it was an argumentative essay. And she loved it. And she wanted me to enter it into a writing contest. I also wrote an essay about Sumner Presbyterian, my youth group, as a personal. One was argumentative, one was personal. And so we entered it into the writing contest, and it was kind of funny. We thought that the argumentative essay would win, but the judge killed it. The judge killed it. Sister Turley, that's Kylie, says that the judge who read my paper didn't even pass it on for consideration in the finals, that she was very concerned about me after reading it and that she basically didn't know what to do with it, was what she told. So it's kind of funny that this was supposed to be analyzing the argument. It wasn't supposed to be, is this person right or wrong? It's just supposed to be, how well is this argued? How do they marshal their evidence? And Kylie gave me 100. She said she'd never given a student a 100 before. She gave me 100. She loved the paper. She thought it was going to win. There was no first place winner. It was like a snub. There was a second place winner, a third place winner, and a couple honorable mentions, but there was no first place winner. This judge killed the essay, seemed to be kind of prejudiced against it because it was arguing against a Mormon principle. But my essay on Sumner Presbyterian won first place for personal essay. So I couldn't complain too much because the one that I didn't think was going to win actually went on to win. But I've got to tell you one more story about Dr. Young. Where did I put that?
Oh, we're going back to Dr. Young. Okay.
Oh, yeah. This story, you'll like this story. This was kind of crazy. Dr. Young has been trying to talk me into taking his ancient Christianity class with him, and I'm not going to name this other doctor, still very much there. I told him I'd sit on the class today, so I came to it and sat there and quietly listened throughout the class. They said many things that I disagreed with, like the ancient Jews were polytheistic, yet they didn't say anything I'd never heard before. They're talking about Margaret Barker. Margaret Barker was like the hero. She was like the non-LDS hero of Mormon apologetics because of her work on the Jews being polytheistic and how the reformations of Josiah made them monotheistic. So Mormons love that. Anyway, I said I'd been around the table with it. It's not new. I've noticed how all my professors, even Huntsman, avoid eye contact with me whenever they're talking about something that they know I disagree with. I guess I can't blame them. They must wonder, perhaps even dread, what I think of all this. Sometimes I think my professors would be better off if they didn't know there's an evangelical Christian in the room. But I know God brought me here to be bold and not silent. Anyhow, Dr. Young was talking about how the ancient Jews were to the ancient Christians what today's non-LDS Christians are to today's Mormons. He slipped and made eye contact with me and burst out laughing. I'm sorry, Jack, he said, referring to what and they called me Jack, my middle name. He said, referring to what he was teaching. I shrugged and chuckled. Then the other doctor said something about me not being a non-member, but a future member. This was also completely gratuitous. I hadn't said anything to them at this point. They were kind of pissing me. That isn't in there, but they were kind of pissing me off. I decided it was time to say something. So I raised my hand and asked, it may be my filthy Gentile ignorance, but if the Jews were completely in apostasy and there was no authority on the earth, where did Zacharias, the father of John the Baptist, get his authority? And where did John the Baptist get his authority? I should probably note here that earlier Dr. Young had passively said that the Jews of Christ's day were in apostasy. Julie Frederick had raised her hand and asked him to clarify what he meant by apostasy. He had responded, I mean as apostate can be, a complete apostasy. There was no authority on the earth. Apparently him and Julie had a sharp disagreement on this point in his other class last semester, and he'd been pretty rude to her. Anyway, as soon as I asked it, I heard Julie whisper, Jack, that's why I love you. And that felt good. But Dr. Young and the other doctor both chuckled. And the other doctor said, Jack, there's two nice young men we could send over to your place to teach you this. And I said, you don't know the answer, do you? Because remember, I took the missionary discussions. I wasn't taught this. I don't know what missionary discussions they're talking about. I was not taught this. Then Julie and Dr. Young's son started trying to whisper the answer to me. And Dr. Young and the other doctor were talking about it with another professor that was in as well. So I didn't hear either answer very well. I was pretty hurt by all this. I mean, I didn't give them permission to tell the class I wasn't Mormon. About half the class already knew, the other was very confused. And my question was serious. It should have been given a serious response. But I guess that's the life of an evangelical at Brigham Young University. So I felt like we kind of had this confrontation, and they were kind of rude to me and were like, oh yeah, the missionaries can come and explain that to you. And it wasn't very respectful of me as a student. So like I said, I had my ups and downs with Dr. Young. He could be really rude and temperamental sometimes and not funny.
So I actually, it's fascinating. So we kind of get a glimpse now of what your interactions as a student was like. So you weren't afraid to give your opinions. They'd even kind of tried to sheepishly not look your way when they're.
Oh yeah.
So you actually were kind of combative, it sounds to me. Like
Oh
you were
yeah.
standing up. Oh wow.
I just gave a sermon this weekend and I told people arguing is my love language. Like I do like to speak up and speak out. At this point, I do try to be respectful if I think they're going into LDS beliefs. But in this case, I felt like they didn't explain their point very well. I guess I had never heard that, everybody was in apostasy and the priesthood had to be restored to John the Baptist or whatever. And there seemed to be disagreement among the Mormon students in the room on it. So it's not clear to me that this is just something the church teaches that the missionaries could explain to me,
Okay. That's
I don't want to call them anti-Semitic, but they were making me really uncomfortable, the things they were saying about the Jews of Christ's day. That was making me really uncomfortable.
Okay, yeah, no, that I can see how that could come across that way. Yeah, I'm reminded there's a professor at James Madison University who I'm trying to remember, I think his first name's Val. And I apologize if you don't remember, if I forget your name. But he went on gospel tangents to one of the reasons was because I gave a talk about a Protestant defense of the Book of Mormon, and he kind of was contrasting it because he has a theory that Lehi was a polytheist and that he was against the Josiah reforms, and that's why he was speaking against it. So his argument is that Lehi from the beginning was a polytheist, which is fascinating to me. That's kind of that's the argument taken a little bit further. He's moved that a little bit to one more level, which I find interesting. So I apologize for your name escapes me, but I believe it's Val. And it was funny that he felt like he needed to kind of come on to go against, not go against, but kind of give a counter to my views on that the Book of Mormon is a pretty thoroughly Protestant somewhat orthodox Christian document, a Protestant document. Yes. And he's trying to make Lehi into a polytheist. So that was interesting. So yeah, that's why you and I, as we engage the restoration, we're able to have these interesting conversations where we're bringing, our views to the table. We're looking at the Book of Mormon and their scriptures through a Protestant lens. And then they're because they're heterodox Christians, if you will. That we come from a more orthodox worldview of Christianity. They're heterodox, so they're going to be using different tools than we're going to be using. And so that just adds to the conversation. And the fact that we're not trying to hate on them or try to win. And although for me, it sounds to me, there were times where you were trying to win an argument at the time as a student, but that's fine because it sounds to me though, that you were having constructive conversations as well at the same time.
We did have very friendly debates, and most of my experiences there were very positive. I mean, in retrospect, I've realized, Dr. Young wasn't entirely who I thought he was, but most of my experiences, they were very positive. My experiences with Kylie, my experiences in many of these classes, it was rare that I had something happen where I was like, okay, you're just being a jerk to me as a non-LDS Christian. It did happen sometimes. But yeah, it didn't happen a ton of the time. And overall, my experience was very positive.
That's good.
So you want to talk about dating?
Yeah, let's talk about dating, because of course, like I said earlier, the part of the reason was you're supposed to go there and go there for a
Get your
few
MRS
semesters.
degree.
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
then so maybe talk about being a single female
Okay.
at Brigham Young University, and kind of what that was like and what ultimately happened.
So I just want to say, first of all, have you heard of NICMO?
NICMO?
Yes. You haven't heard of NICMO? NICMO was real. NICMO stands for non-committal makeout. And it was this
Oh,
website
okay.
in the
Got
late 90s, early 2000s. And it was like Tinder for Mormons, but for making out only, because, premarital sex is bad, but it's fine to make out with whoever you want to. And it was real. I never did it, but a very close friend of mine did and verified to me that it was real and that he met up with a woman and made out with her. So yeah, NICMO is not an urban legend. It existed. Somebody on Facebook just told me yesterday that it still exists. I'm like, really? Don't you guys just use Tinder and say we're just going to make out and not go all the way? But I don't know. Maybe it still exists. But NICMO, NCMO, non-committal makeout, just a funny little story from the BYU underworld. It was real. Um, so my freshman year, though, I dated a guy. I had broken up with Sean, and Sean and I were not romantic anymore. But my freshman year, my roommate said, "Hey, you should date this guy. He's a lot like you." They set me up with him. I asked him to preference. His name was Hales, and I really hit it off with Hales. By the way, I'm using his very distinctive real name with his permission. I really hit it off with Hales, but Hales was very clear with me that he would only marry a Mormon woman in the temple. So we had like this insane chemistry. Have you seen The Big Bang Theory?
Oh, yeah.
Hills is like Sheldon Cooper on The Big Bang Theory, and let's be serious, that's exactly my type. Um,
Okay.
but we were both very eccentric and odd. I may be on the spectrum a little bit. So we were both very eccentric and odd, and we just had great chemistry and great conversations. We never even kissed or held hands, but there was just a lot of aggressive flirting, and we clearly liked each other. But I think we both saw this barrier there, that this was a passing dalliance, like we knew it could not be because he was so serious about getting married in the temple. Hales kind of, unintentionally broke my heart because I was so into him. He left for his mission. But I did go on a couple of dates with Mormon guys. We kind of joked about it because I did it more than any of my Mormon roommates. But they would go on like one date with me and then see that I was serious about not joining the church, and they were like, "Okay, that's enough." So my the year 2002, the year that started 2002, I was I would usually come to the opening socials with the Mormon Ward, and I'm standing there, and I'm very tall. I'm standing there and I see this guy across the way from me, and he's tall and attractive and athletic, dark hair, piercing blue eyes, and I just thought that is a gorgeous guy, but I left the Mormon boys alone. I didn't see him too much for the rest of the year, but apparently he saw me too. And he went to church looking for me, and they were like, "She doesn't come to church here. She's not Mormon." And he's like, "Rats," But he had noticed me too, and he was attracted to me too. But later in the year, when I was the president of the Evangelical Christian Bible Study, he started coming to our Tuesday afternoon Bible study. And he started asking all these questions about interfaith dialogue and interfaith aspects, asking. We read How Wide the Divide together later on. He would read Protestant books. He showed a lot of interest in me, but in evangelicalism as well. Like, he didn't want to convert, but he was like the friendly interfaith dialogue guy. And I guess I began to wonder if a relationship between a Mormon and an evangelical couldn't work. And there was a professor at BYU named Juliana Borio Goetz. She's Catholic, and her husband Steve Goetz is also Catholic. He's Mormon. They're in the chemistry department, and they've been making interfaith marriage work for many years. I spoke with Jana Reese, who she's Mormon, and I think her husband at the time was Methodist or Presbyterian. I think now he's Episcopalian, but he's Protestant, and they've made it work for a very long time. So I began talking to other interfaith couples and seeing how they did things, and wondering if we could make things work. And because we seem to have really good chemistry. The thing about, I'm going to call my husband Bruce, and that's not his name, and his identity is not Fort Knox, but please, nobody contact him. Let him have his privacy. But Bruce, he made me feel beautiful. Like, I was so insecure. He made me feel beautiful. I thought we were a stunning couple. He always seemed to know the exact right thing to say to me. And I had told him when we were dating, "You are a tall and attractive guy. Don't you think you could, you can get a Mormon woman to marry you if that's what you want?" And he was like, "Yeah, but she wouldn't be you." So he always seemed to know the exact right thing to say to me. And let me see where it is. There's a letter that he wrote me. He just always seemed to know the perfect thing to say. He knew about my trauma. He knew what I'd been through with my father. Oh, I think it's in this one. Sorry, I have so many journals, me and the journaling. But he knew what I'd been through. Oh, there's my debate with Julie. Okay. My stuff is a little
Oh, by the way, folks, so Dr. Val Larson was the name
Dr.
of
Val Larson.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's the person that came out with that new theory about Lehigh.
April 27th, 2003. I was talking to Bruce and I was like, I don't understand. You're a tall, good-looking guy. You should have no trouble finding an LDS girlfriend. Then you won't have to go through with all this interfaith stuff. And he was like, it doesn't matter. They're not you. And I said, this seems so soon, but I really could love this boy. And I came from this very insecure background, and I thought, if I marry a Mormon guy, I'm gonna get it. I'm gonna get that peaceful family that I wanted, that peaceful, secure family. So he wrote me this letter. This is dated May 6, 2003. I've often wondered why you are the way you are, so energetic and caring. Every day I try to envision your face in those gentle eyes, the ones that bring me to your consuming embrace. I bask in your light and drown in joy while held in your arms. To me, you are the greatest creation of the God we love so much. I can see his hand through you. Watching how you act, how you speak, makes me weary with a longing, lingering desire to see you as the angel you are. I do not believe that any man truly deserves you. No one ever will. I stand in awe at your grace, grace. A tower of triumph of mountain fashion into a monument. I have never met anyone greater. Words will never say all you are. No language earth made can. Mystifying, magnificent, wonderful, are but trivial poetics compared to you. Lingering kisses make me wish for that moment's peace to last. Through you have I seen eternity. That peace of God's bosom, is this a piece of our Savior's love? Is that love like those moments? All the ink and paper never could hold enough to say in an adequate language or prose just how much I love you, and I always will. So he said these beautiful things to me. He did these beautiful things. I remember he bought flowers for my entire apartment. We got this mystery delivery of flowers to the entire apartment. We didn't know who it was. 6 women in the apartment. It was probably $200 worth of flowers. We didn't know who got these. And every guy that one of us was dating denied that it was him. And then sometime later, Bruce said that it was him. And I was just floored. This guy seemed to love me so much that he'd spend $200 on flowers just so he could give them to me to not know that it was from him. So we kind of had this, I thought it was a beautiful interfaith relationship. And years later, when I was at Trinity, I was talking to one of my fellow students. And when they found out I was married to a Mormon, he was like, wow, he must really love you. And I was like, why do you say that? And he said, well, I wouldn't even move to Detroit for my wife. And this guy gave up godhood for you. Like, he must think you're amazing, So that's what I thought I had. I thought I had this beautiful, poetic, interfaith relationship with a guy who wanted to do interfaith dialogue and have friendly conversations about our different religions. The things I saw later in the marriage, I never saw while we were dating. And now I recognize that this was love bombing. I know what that is now. But I'd come from such a traumatic background that for somebody to treat me this way and to tell me these things, I kind of fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. So we got married at Rock Canyon Assembly of God. The reception was held at the LDS Ward House, and we would attend church together. Like, we'd go once a month, we'd go to my church, and then the next week we'd go to our own churches. Then the week after, we'd go to his church together. Then the next week we'd go to our own churches, and fifth Sundays were just whatever. So once a month I visited the LDS ward. Once a month he visited the Protestant church. We read books together. We read C.S. Lewis together. We had friendly discussions. We would read scripture together. We actually had a friend that for our wedding, they gave us a custom set. It was the NIV Bible, because that's evangelical, and it was the Book of Mormon. And it was made to look like a set that went together. And I think I didn't look at it as marrying an unbeliever. I honestly believe this man was a Christian, albeit one with some false theology, but I thought he was a Christian and a righteous man and a believer in God. And I thought it was more like marrying a Catholic a Protestant and a Catholic, but a little more distorted than that, a little more challenges. We agreed that our children would not be baptized as infants, that they would be dedicated in both churches. We do LDS blessing and naming, and we dedicate them in my church. And in the beginning, we prayed together, though that became a problem later on. The Daily Universe wanted to do a story about us, and this reporter came out and asked us all these questions, and we were told the story was going to run the next day. That's the BYU newspaper, by the way.
So thank you.
And then the story didn't show up. And I contacted the reporter, was like, hey, where's the story? And she said it was canceled by the overlords there because it was too affirming of interfaith marriage and affirming of people sinning, I guess. And I was like, I don't understand. You guys just did a feature on interracial marriage a couple months ago, and they said, oh, we got so much flack for the interracial marriage. We got so much pushback for doing a story on interracial marriage. So apparently there was still quite a lot of racism at BYU that a positive story about an interracial marriage would trigger so many Mormons. But she had good instincts, because later, a couple years later, I was interviewed by Naomi Schaefer Riley for the Washington Post about interfaith marriage. We were on PBS Religion and Ethics News Weekly for interfaith marriage, and a spot that was very affirming of us. So I think this reporter had the correct instincts that this was an interesting story about interfaith marriage. But do you want to hear about coming to Trinity? We had an interesting incident when we came to Trinity.
So you tell them, first of all, what is Trinity, the university? Why did you go there? And just kind of talk a little bit about that, some background.
Absolutely. This is a great story. In 2002, a group of students came to the BYU campus. I think they wanted to convert Mormons. I don't know how many Mormons they converted, but they converted me to attending Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. They were Trinity students. Trinity is a seminary in the Midwest, in the Chicagoland area, and it's really one of the leaders in evangelical thought. In the past, we've had D.A. Carson, Grant Osborne, Richard Averbeck, he's emeritus now. We've just had some really powerful heavy hitters in evangelicalism. Carl F. Henry. We have Kevin J. Van Hooser now. He's a theologian, theological interpretation of scripture, very big deal. Trinity has just consistently produced leaders in evangelical thought and leaders in the church, and they have a wide diversity of programs for such a small seminary. A lot of seminaries, they just have like a master's in theological studies and then you specialize somewhere, but Trinity actually had New Testament, Old Testament. They had American church history and regular church history, and I didn't know if I was going to do New Testament or American church history, but because of my love of Mormon studies, I kind of wound up sliding from classics over to American church history. But I wanted to go there. I kind of was in love with them after meeting the Trinity students. And they have PhD programs in educational studies, intercultural studies, and theological studies, which is Old Testament, New Testament, systematic theology, and church history. So they've got a wide variety of programs, and just they seem to consistently produce evangelical thought leaders. And unlike some evangelical seminaries that are all egalitarian or all complementarian, like, it's officially a complementarian seminary, meaning male headship, male leadership, but it has many egalitarians on faculty, and we're always in conversation about it. We're always in conversation about difficult issues. So it's really a place where I think evangelical thought gets done and evangelical scholarship gets done.
Is it affiliated with a particular church?
Yes, it's affiliated with the Evangelical Free, but it's always been broader than Evangelical Free. Like some seminaries, almost every professor there is going to be from that denomination, but Trinity has always had a variety of professors from different denominations. So, they have Calvinists there, they have Arminians. They now have Felipe Dovale, who's I think he's Brazilian American, and he's becoming one of the leaders in evangelical thought on gender and sexuality. So they're always doing exciting work there, and in my opinion, have great programs. But I don't know if these guys converted any Mormons, but they converted me to Trinity, and I wanted to go to Trinity when I was done with BYU. So eventually, we made our way out there. Bruce did not graduate. I did finish my degree in 2005. Bruce did not graduate, wound up dropping out, and it took a couple years. We took a couple years off, but in 2009, we wound up coming out. We wound up relocating to Chicago to attend Trinity. But there was an incident during admissions. So I had always been open with them about the fact that I had a Mormon husband. I never tried to hide or conceal that because I knew it could be controversial among evangelicals. So I'd always been upfront about that. But I guess one of the admissions people didn't understand exactly what I was saying, because later on when he found out I had a Mormon husband, he told me he thought I meant that I married him and then converted. He didn't know that I married him as a Christian. So the admissions guy was not happy about this and didn't want to let me in. There were some people in admin that didn't want to let me in. So what they wound up doing was they contacted, since I wanted to be church history, they contacted the church history department, Doug Sweeney, Scott Manich, John Woodbridge. This is 2009. They contacted them and said, hey, do you still want her? Because we're kind of skeeved out by her marrying a Mormon when she was a Christian. And all three of them said, if she wants to come here, you let her come here. So they kind of went to bat for me and stood up for me. And Scott Manich is still my advisor today, and I recently talked with him about this, and he confirmed that it was true and that it did happen. So that was kind of something that happened with us as an interfaith couple.
So just, it's so you're now in the Chicagoland area. You're studying at Trinity. What's going on with your marriage at this time as well? What's happening?
So let me tell you about two kind of big incidents that happened in terms of our searching for a church when we got to Chicago. I'd never been to a church with a female pastor, so I began looking for a church that had a female pastor just because I'd always believed in it. But incidentally, all the churches I'd gone to, they were like, yes, female pastors, but we don't have one here. So I started looking for a church with a female pastor, and I found one that on paper looked like a good option. It was close to us. The pastor was a graduate of Trinity, and she had been Trinity admin. So I reached out to her, but I didn't tell her that I had a Mormon husband. I reached out and asked if, she could call me and we could chat, because I wanted to see what her attitude was towards Mormons, And I took our daughter. We had a daughter in 2006. Daughter out to play at the playground. And when I came home, my husband was on the phone and he was asking very aggressive questions about Mormonism, like just very aggressive questions. And my heart kind of sank because I'm like, I knew there could only be one person he was talking to, right? I'm just like, who are you talking to? And then he's like, oh, she just walked in. Here, let me put her on. He's like, it's that pastor you reached out to. And I'm just crestfallen listening to the way he was talking to her. So I started trying to talk to her. Do you know who Bill Schnoblin is?
Yes.
It was like if Bill Schnoblin and Walter Martin had a baby. She started going off on me about, I kept trying to explain, I wanted to explain our family situation. She just kept cutting me off and telling me Mormonism is satanic. Mormonism is demonic. Mormons are going to hell. This is from Satan. You're in a very bad situation. She just kept on lecturing me and cutting me off. And I was just trying to explain my family situation. And I don't know why. I guess I tentatively agreed to come to her church, which I probably should have said this isn't for me. But I think later that day or the next day, she sends me an email and she says, Dear Bridget, since our goal at my church is to release our people into ministry, I believe after our conversation that would not be possible for me to release you into ministry. Therefore, I believe you need to continue your search elsewhere for an appropriate church home for you and your family. We will not be seeing you then on the 23rd of August. Sincerely, Pastor, what's her name? I wrote back to her because I thought this was appalling, okay? And this is the letter I wrote. It's dated August 15th, 2009. It's in my file. It's called Letter to a Christian Pastor. Dear Pastor, her name. Our conversation has really weighed on my heart since we spoke last Monday. I put much thought and prayer into this letter, and I hope you'll give honest consideration to what I have to say. It was probably fairly obvious to you that I was disappointed by how our discussion went. I'm not always a very assertive person in real-time exchanges. Writing is and always has been my strength. As such, I didn't really tell you everything I wanted to say to you as you were speaking. It felt like when I began trying to explain to you my history with Mormonism and my interfaith family needs, it was as though your guard went up and the tone of our conversation completely changed. I don't doubt for a moment that your concern was genuine. I'm not really bothered that you hold the views on Mormonism that you do, that Mormonism is a false gospel which preaches a different Jesus, I quoted her, the brother of Satan, and that Mormons are deceived and going to hell. I wasn't completely clear on your opinion of Freemasonry and by extension the LDS temple ceremony, but you seem to be one of those people who holds its origins to be satanic and or occultic. I know very well that such an attitude is fairly common among evangelicals who have studied Mormonism, which is precisely why I'm trying to screen potential pastors and churches to see how they will react to my interfaith family situation. My husband has heard all those things before. They aren't helpful. What he needs when he visits his wife's church are people who will welcome him and treat him with love and respect. What did bother me about our conversation was how you presented your information. As I began trying to explain my family's needs, you repeatedly cut me off to inject your views on Mormonism. I could not even finish a sentence without you correcting me on how bad Mormonism is. Is that how you do ministry at your church? Interrupting people and lecturing them on how bad their problems are instead of first listening to them and letting them describe their situation in their own terms. Let's say Mormonism is every bit as bad and as dangerous as you say it is. If I had told you that my husband was a raging alcoholic, would you have launched into a lecture on how dangerous alcoholism is? I may offend you horribly by saying this, but here goes. I really came away feeling like you misunderstand the purpose of church. It isn't the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. If you really believe Mormons are lost and deceived, shouldn't you be doing everything in your power to get Mormons into evangelical churches where they can hear true preaching? And when an evangelical woman calls you and says, my husband is Mormon and he wants to come to church with me once a month, shouldn't your reaction be, praise the Lord, bring him to ours? You've indicated that you feel like your church fills a special niche and you only look for a certain type of worshiper. But I'll admit that confuses me horribly. I've never heard of a church which does not minister to the spiritually sick or is selective in which types of sicknesses it tries to minister to. And then I basically apologized to her and said, I'm sorry for how he talked to you, though, because that was completely unfair to you, and I apologize for that. I sent her a peacemaker in Provo on my pastor in Rock Canyon Assembly of God. Anyway, I just want to say I wrote this in 2009. Since writing this, I have done 94 credits of master's level work at 3 different seminaries. I've done 26 credits of doctoral level work at Trinity. I stand by every word I wrote. This woman's model of church was false and pernicious. And if you're saying Mormons are going to hell and then you're chasing them away from your church, I'm not sure Mormons are the ones who are satanic. Okay, I cannot condemn this strongly enough. And it's embarrassing to me that this woman came out of Trinity and was part of Trinity administration at some point. I think that's embarrassing. I think when she said her church is a special niche church that only caters to a certain type of worshiper, what she meant was only a select number of people can put up with me as pastor and I can't grow my church. I will say, though, I think she said something about her dad being Mormon, or she had some Mormon male relative in her past. I can't remember. The conversation is very old. But I will say that I think there was a deep wounding in her past. And I think Mormonism was part of it, or her Mormon father, or whoever it was. And I really do hope that she heals. This was unpastoral, unprofessional, and just pernicious and false, her model of church. But I do think that she was a wounded person. We've picked on the evangelicals. Let's pick on the Mormons just a little. The same month, my ex-husband, or my then husband, contacted the ward, the LDS ward. And you know how it is with LDS wards. You're assigned where you're assigned. It's based on where you live. So you don't get to shop around. So he contacted the LDS ward and he went out to the temple with the first counselor and the bishop. So I think a week later, it was the first weekend of September, it's fast and testimony meeting. So I did this thing. I spoke at fast and testimony meetings many times at BYU. I would just give a very neutral, I would say who I was and what my background was, and give a very neutral testimony that Mormons and evangelicals could agree with. It was a way to introduce our family to the ward later when we were married. It was a way to let them know we were here, you know. I thought it was healthy and wholesome. And nobody had ever told me fast and testimony meeting is for members only and you need to ask for permission before you do it. You know, it was always open mic. And I'd done it many times at BYU and no one had ever said anything but thank you. Thank you for your testimony. So we're walking into fast and testimony meeting and the first counselor kind of accosts us in the doorway. And he says, I heard you were going to speak at fast and testimony meeting today. We don't want you to. And I'm like, well, first of all, I'm like, how did you know I was going to speak at fast? But I'm just crestfallen. Like, why are they singling me out as a non-LDS person and picking on me like that, you know? So we did, I talked to my husband. He's like, oh, I told them you were going to do it. I'm like, oh, why didn't you give me a heads up that they seemed uncomfortable with it? And I don't know. He claimed he didn't know. But I later met with the bishop, and what the bishop did was he went out to my blog and he found something that offended him. And then he's like, this is why the Holy Spirit told me not to let you speak in fast and testimony meeting. And I just felt like this guy was picking on me. Like he clearly had something of a prejudice against mixed faith families, you know?
Mhm.
So at the time I was like, I'm not coming to your LDS ward. These people are bigots. Okay. I'm not dealing with this. And my husband kind of turned on me and agreed with him that I should be asking for permission to speak at fast and testimony meeting, but nobody ever told me that at BYU. The handbook was not public. It was not made public. So how was I, as a non-member, supposed to know that non-members aren't welcome to speak in fast and testimony meeting? You know, nobody ever corrected me. The first counselor was actually a good man, though, and he worked really hard at rebuilding bridges with us. And I did eventually get more involved in the ward, but it was initially a very negative experience. The other thing the bishop did, the same bishop, was he asked my husband if he had married me because he had to. He was implying that I had gotten pregnant and baby trapped him,
Mm.
which, not trying to be TMI here, but we didn't break the law of chastity for marriage. So no, I didn't get pregnant and baby trap him, but it was very offensive that he would attribute that kind of behavior to me as a woman and suggest that my husband wouldn't have married me unless, you know, I was conniving and lured him in, you know. So we overall had pretty positive experiences with our churches. I'm still at the church that I wound up at instead of this other woman's church, but there were just a couple of incidents that were hard on us as an interfaith family.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, I can see how there'd be challenges, and it's funny because you're in a situation where the church is to there. It first and foremost is supposed to be there to be supportive of keeping marriages intact, and
yes,
helping have counseling, whatever. That's one of the key roles the church can play, is to keep families together and to nourish them and take care of them. And when on both, and you have instances on both cases where they dropped the ball. They didn't
yes.
do what they did not, they turned their back on their pastoral role.
Yes. Even the one who told us that we couldn't come to her church, she wasn't like, here's some referrals, try these churches. I've spoken with this pastor here. You know, that's what you do. You should be concerned that this family is going to church somewhere. And she didn't do that. And yeah, a lot of challenges for local churches for sure. But I will say though, in retrospect, you know, I'm divorced now, and I will say in retrospect, both of these incidents were precipitated by a conversation with my husband, and that I either wasn't present for or that I was only partially present for. So I don't know how antagonistic he was or how he portrayed me. So I feel like he may have stirred the pot. He definitely stirred the pot with the pastor, but he may have stirred the pot with the bishop and the first counselor and kind of created this situation. That possibility does exist, but it was difficult on us as an interfaith family for people to be treating us this way.
And why do you just because you're mentioning your husband? Why was your husband at this point trying to sabotage your marriage? Do you think, or what? Or is he trying to sabotage you? What do you suppose was his motivation to actually do that?
This may be a good point to get into the breakdown of the marriage.
Okay.
So let me talk about a broad overall problem first. So Mormon epistemology, personal revelation. You read the Book of Mormon and it's true. You know, you get warm feelings, you pray about it. James 1:5, you ask God, you pray about it, you get warm feelings, it's true. And you can theoretically apply that to anything in your life, right? What are the controls here? If I'm going to God and I'm asking God about something and I feel like God is telling me to do this, well, what is there to say actually you're reading things incorrectly? God didn't tell you to do this, you know? I don't know if that's well addressed in Mormonism. So we got married, and after we got married, it was kind of like a different person emerged, and he became kind of brittle. He was no longer this friendly interfaith dialogue guy,
Hmm.
and he seemed to exhibit something of a persecution complex. He would frustrate me because he was never asking about, and I wrote all this in my journal. I kept a very meticulous account of our fights. He would ask me about highly negative things like blacks in the priesthood or polygamy, and then he would get mad about my answers. And if I tried to say, I don't want to discuss this with you, I feel like it would lead to a fight, he would just get mad about that too.
Hmm.
So it was like he wanted to be picked on. Like,
Okay.
one time during that first year, he asked me, well, what do you think of Joseph Smith? And I was like, I'm Protestant. What do you think I think of Joseph Smith? He's like, no, really, I want to know what you think of Joseph Smith. And I was like, I really don't want to discuss this with you. I feel like it's going to offend you and just lead to a fight. Because at this point, we were having these kind of brittle fights. But he was like, he got in my face and he yelled at me, you tell me what you think of the prophet Joseph Smith. So I finally said, okay, I think he's a fraud and a false prophet. Okay, that's what I think.
Okay.
If I, as a Christian, were to marry a Jew, I would not get in their face and demand that they tell me what they think of Jesus Christ. They're Jewish. They don't believe Jesus is the Messiah. But when I told him this, he kind of smirked. He seemed kind of self-satisfied. And he was like, if I'd known you felt this way, I never would have married you. He didn't seem upset about it, though. I think he was on a fishing expedition. And I'll get to why in just a second. But we've been married about 10 months. And he comes to me. And he says he's been thinking about divorcing me. And he's pretty much made up his mind to divorce me. And I'm like, why? You know, I was afraid he's going to bring up the Joseph Smith thing or the fights we've been having. And he's like, you're the perfect wife. Everything is perfect. I love you. I really want to be with you. But I need to get married in the temple. And so when he started dating me, this was like the first thing I brought up to him because I was heartbroken about Sean and I was heartbroken about Hales. And I said, don't date me if you think you want a temple marriage. Don't even date me. If you're pretty sure you want a temple marriage, let's not do this again. So that was like the first boundary I ever laid down with him. And now we've been married 10 months and he's telling me he wants a temple marriage after all. He made a mistake. And he says, I wish it could be you, but I know how serious you are about Protestantism. And, he's like, our faiths are dividing us, He didn't want to do therapy. He didn't want to do anything. He just wanted to go. And I was absolutely distraught. But I'll tell you, I actually breathed a sigh of relief. And here's why. I said, Bruce, this is addressed in the Bible, 1 Corinthians 7:15. It says, if you are married and your spouse is an unbeliever, don't put away the unbelieving spouse. Stay with them. If they will have you, stay with them. So I was like, Bruce, this exact situation is addressed in the Bible. Like, it's assuming Mormonism is true and you're the real believer here and I'm the unbeliever. It's right there in God's word. Don't divorce your wife. And he said, I know, but I have to go to the temple and pray about it. And I should say here also that he had claimed when his parents asked him not to marry me, he told his mom literally, Mom, I prayed about this in the celestial room of the temple. Maybe you should too. So he claimed, again, that this personal revelation piece that God had told him to marry me. And now he's claiming he's got to ask God whether or not to divorce me. And I'm like, that's insane. God's not going to, I'm evangelical. That's insane. God doesn't contradict his word, but you go and pray about it. I honestly believed Bruce was a Christian. I honestly believed he would do the right thing. So he comes home from the temple and he crosses the kitchen and he gives me kind of this light kiss on the mouth. And I'm like, okay, you're kissing me, so we're staying together, right? And he says, no, I'm divorcing you. Literally betrayed with a kiss. Literally, he's betraying me with a kiss like Judas Iscariot. And we, I moved out, and for the next couple of months, this is while I'm at BYU, by the way. This is my senior year, my final year. I'm trying to do my GREs. I've got so much going on with wrapping up my degree, and he's doing this to me. And he just kept on insisting there's no need for therapy. There's nothing to talk about. I'm divorcing you because I want a temple marriage, and you can't give me that, So I'm just destroyed. But I think it was in that moment that I stopped believing he was a Christian, because you don't get to go to the holiest place in your religion and say, God gave me permission to sin. Okay, like, clearly you're not listening to God if you think you're going to the holiest place in your religion and you're getting this special permission to sin. So I was distraught, though. And after a couple of months with arguing with him, I finally decided I'm going to join the LDS church. So I started talking to the bishop about setting up a baptism date. And I went and I talked to Bruce. And I told Bruce, I'm joining the church. And Bruce just kind of looked like a deer caught in the headlights. And he said very quietly, okay, congratulations. And that was what I was expecting. I thought he'd embrace me. I thought he'd say, thank God our marriage is saved. And so I'm like, okay, do you want to move into my place or should I move back into your place? And he's like, oh, I'm still divorcing you. And I'm like, wait, what? because he literally said this was the only reason he wanted a divorce.
Right. There's some kind of,
something is going on here that he's not telling me. He
Yep.
starts making up other reasons, but it didn't make any sense because all of his other reasons could be addressed by therapy or at least trying. I went and talked to Eric Huntsman. Because I was going to ask him to baptize me. And I told him I was joining the church. And he did not look happy. He looked at me and he said, you know, Bridget, if you want to join us, I'm happy for you. I'm really happy for you. But God is different. God is different in Mormonism. And do you really think you could stop believing in the Nicene Creed? Do you really think you could stop believing in the Trinity? And I realized that I could not. That is what I believed to the core of my being. And that I was being ridiculous. And of course I wasn't going to be Mormon. Of course I'm not Mormon. So.
Wow.
So I decided to let him go and to stop fighting him. I mean, I wasn't super compliant. And a female friend that he was very close to stopped being friends with him. And he came crawling back to me.
Interesting.
We stayed together for 10 more years. But
oh my goodness, 10 more years. And was the marriage, how healthy of a marriage was this?
I think in retrospect that it was very unhealthy, but I didn't know this at the time because I'd come from such a dysfunctional family environment. And I didn't understand that love is not supposed to hurt, like not for forever. If it's hurting for forever, there is something very wrong here.
Yeah.
But since I came from a house with dysfunction and a house where love and relationships hurt, I thought that was just the way things were. So I don't want to like list off a laundry list of all the abuses and all the things he did to me. But one consistent pattern, though, was this personal revelation piece that he would claim he had prayed about something and God says, I get my way and you don't get it. Mormons call it unrighteous dominion. I call it coercive patriarchal bullshit, but not sure that's a good place where like later on in the marriage, like I remember we were discussing women in ministry and I was so tired of him always being like, oh, but let me back up a bit here. Let me back up 1 second. So 10 years later, when we did get divorced, my roommates from BYU, they came to me. My roommates and Hales, they came to me and they said, you know that he was cheating on you at BYU, right? And it all came crashing. Like now everything makes so sense. Dumb that I didn't see it. So dumb. He didn't want to marry in the temple in the abstract. He wanted to marry a specific person. And then when I said, okay, I'll marry you in the temple, bro, of course he said no, because there was, and I began to realize that there was a pattern here and that there were many things that I had missed. Since I don't have firsthand information, since I didn't catch him cheating and can't personally verify that, I just want to say that later when I asked him about this, he denied it. He said my roommates are lying or mistaken. Hales is lying or mistaken. But I believe my roommates. I believe Hales. I believe that the real reason for this divorce request was that he was cheating on me and that he was trying to leave me for this other woman. And that was the real reason. He didn't want therapy. He didn't want me to join the church. It makes sense to me. But he denies it. I'm just giving his side of the story there. But this personal revelation thing kept on coming up. It was insidious that he seemed to feel that he had the right to just go and pray about something and then say, okay, God says this and I get my way. And they tell the girls at BYU, they tell you, never marry a man who receives personal revelation for both of you. Don't marry a guy who basically thinks he can talk. Like, they know this is a problem with Mormon guys. They know this. The problem is it doesn't necessarily take the form of somebody saying, hey, I received personal revelation for both of us. It can take the form of he just doesn't listen to you. He's like, I prayed about this. God says this, so we're going to do this. And he just doesn't. He doesn't ask you to pray about it. He doesn't ask what God told you. But like I told him, I was tired of him doing this to me at one point. So I told him, basically, I've prayed about women in ministry and God has told me that he calls women as prophets, apostles, judges, deacons. These are all in the Bible. These are all in the Bible. And he freaked out at me. He completely freaked out. It was like he had never considered that other people can do this. I prayed about it and God told me I'm right thing. He freaked out at me. He grabbed my wrist. He starts dragging me towards the bedroom. and saying, we are going to pray about this until God tells one of us that we are wrong. And I told him, I dug my heels in, I broke his grab on my wrist, and I told him, absolutely not. I don't think I'm ever going to pray with you again. So it was not a healthy marriage in that regard. And this came up again and again, this kind of insidious thing where he felt like he could pray. And I see now, he did it to his parents when he was dating me. He told his parents, hey, I prayed about this and God says I'm right, so stop bothering me about this, you know? It just didn't occur to me that he was going to use this on me. Much later, going forward 10 years in our marriage, when I was pregnant with our second, a Mormon coworker joined his work, and he was like immediately obsessed with her. He was basically, it wasn't physical, but he was obsessed with her. He was spending 15% of our income on our living expenses with her. He was partying with her until 6 a.m. on weekends. And I told him I wanted this stuff to stop. And by the way, he had told me I could not have coffee with the opposite sex. So I'm telling him, you know, I'm okay with you being friends with the opposite sex, but you can't party with her till 6 a.m. on Friday nights, and you can't give her 15% of our income, and you can't drive her around for 3 hours a day. That's too much. You want to be friends with her, be friends with her, but this is too much. And he went and he prayed about it. About a week later, he came to me and said, I prayed about it, and God says to keep supporting her. It was like, and let mine handmaid Bridget receive the coworker that hath been given unto my servant Bruce. You know, he just seemed to think he could use this personal revelation thing. I also didn't agree with him about his job. He was a dance instructor. It didn't make any money. I was trying to get him to consider doing it part-time and maybe doing something else. And he's like, I prayed about it. God wants me to be a dance instructor. I'm like, did God tell you how we're supposed to live on $300 every 2 weeks? You know, like, this was hobby pay. And he just kind of kept on beating me over the head with this personal revelation thing. So you can't work with somebody like that. Like, you can't negotiate with somebody who is convinced that the God of the universe has signed off on this. And like I said, this is in Mormon culture. They're aware that this is a problem in some marriages. And I think that sometimes you do deal with this in interfaith dialogue. Like, I had a very dear close friend tell me one time Jesus Christ himself appeared to her and told her the LDS church is true. I didn't know what to say because I don't want to be rude, but I don't believe Jesus Christ appeared to you and told you that. Like, I think either you made that up or you were interpreting things wrong, or, you know, that's not what he said. He said something else and you're taking it that way. I don't know, but I don't believe Jesus Christ appeared to you and told you the LDS church is true. And when you do that, I feel like this is kind of dialogue stopping. Like, you can't have a dialogue with someone who's just shutting down everything with God tells me I'm right, you know? So anyway.
Yeah, no, and just so just within the charismatic and Pentecostal traditions, you'll see some similar manipulation happen as well.
And you saw it in Protestant history with the Anabaptists and the radical reformers, not in the exact same terms, but they basically tried to say the Holy Spirit has told us we are right. And the other Protestant reformers were like, yeah, we prayed about it and the Holy Spirit says we're right too. And it's interesting because the Anabaptists and the radical reformers also experimented with polygamy. So something about this gets people thinking polygamy might be a good idea. But you know, we kind of quasi separated after I had the baby, after I had the son that you met earlier off camera.
Okay.
And Bruce, you know, there was a lot of back and forth between us about reconciling, but Bruce started dating Aurora. I'm going to call her Aurora. And Aurora was my replacement. She was not Mormon. She was Protestant. And he was recreating his courtship with me, with her. Like, she'd send him a verse from the Bible and he'd send her a verse from the Book of Mormon. And they're doing the friendly interfaith dialogue thing again. Like, it's all happening again with her. And Aurora even looked like me, like a slightly younger, shorter version of me with the red hair and things, you know, she even looked like me. And there was an incident that happened. Constantine was, I think, 8 or 9 months old, and I was good friends. I had made positive connections with the LDS community, and I was good friends with a man named Brent Smith and his wife Amy. He was the second counselor of the Arlington Heights First Ward, I think, and they had invited me to their baby blessing. And I told them, you know, I'm not on good terms with Bruce. He's dating Aurora. They're being pretty nasty to me. Like, I'm afraid that if I come to your church, he's going to be there. And they said, oh, Bruce hasn't come in months. Bruce has not been here in months. You know, we don't think he'll be here. So I said, okay. So So I came with Constantine. I think I had my brother watch my older child. I came with Constantine though, because he needed to nurse. I came in and I sat in the front row. And I remember I waited till the service got started. I looked around and I didn't see Bruce and Aurora. So I breathed a sigh of relief because I was really nervous because this is technically Bruce's church, you know? So I sat there for the baby blessing, and Brent and Amy blessed their baby, and they did not know that Mormon Evangelical Jerry Springer was happening behind us because Bruce and Aurora had come in late and sat in the back. And I'm sitting in the front with Bruce's baby, who's 9 months old, and Bruce is sitting back there with my replacement. And he knows I'm there. He can see me. He can see his son. He doesn't take off. He snuggles up to Aurora, puts his arm around her. She's wearing like a slinky black dress, puts his arm around her. And so after the baby blessing, my son was restless. He needed to nurse. So I get up, turn around, and I see them sitting there. And I just cannot believe it. He's sitting there with his arm around her. She won't look me in the eye. She knows what she's doing is wrong. I don't know. I just tried to, I'm sure other people could see this happening. Brent and Amy can see this happening because they're sitting up front. And I just took my son and walked past them. And I went into the mother's room to nurse my son. And I cried and cried and cried. And other Mormons came and they comforted me and they told me that what he was doing was wrong. But I gotta say, Brent is the MVP. Because Brent, after the service, Brent goes to the hallway and he's like, "Hey, Bruce, can I talk to you?" And he pulls Bruce aside. And he's like, "Hey, Bruce, you know you're still married, right?" And he confronts Bruce about what he's doing. And I mean, but you remember that letter that I read to you, that lovely letter that he wrote me? Like, how did he go from the guy who's telling me that I'm perfect and I'm graceful and I'm everything that he wants to the guy who's parading my replacement around sacrament meeting? How did my life become this? I'm just trying to have this tranquil, peaceful life and make positive relationships with my LDS friends, and he's doing this Jerry Springer stuff. Like, I can't deal with this anymore. So he was actually the one who there was back and forth between us. Bruce was actually the one who filed for divorce. I took 1 Corinthians 7:15. I printed it out. I put it on my wall, and I told myself, "Let the unbelieving husband depart." And I also had a lot of mourning to do. So I believe in personal revelation, Steve. I absolutely believe in personal revelation. When my daughter was born, my first daughter, I had this horrible feeling about her. Okay, they placed her in my arms. I had this horrible feeling about her. I just looked at her and I said, "Does my baby have a cleft palate?" The doctors looked at me like I was a crazy woman, because that's awfully specific, right? I didn't say there's something wrong with my baby or a cleft palate's in the roof of the mouth, you know? And they looked at me like I was crazy. Like, "No, crazy mom, your baby doesn't have a cleft palate." But I was like, "Would you take her and check?" So the nurse took her. I'm sure they were expecting to say, "No, of course not." And then the nurse was like, "Doctor, I think there's something here." So the doctor came and checked. She said she didn't think there was anything there, but she'd have the pediatrician check. And a couple hours later, pediatrician comes into my hospital room and wants to know if I'm a doctor. And I'm like, "Why?" He's like, "Because your daughter has a partial soft cleft palate. It's very tiny. They usually miss it. How did you know that she had it?" I don't know. God told me. So I do believe in personal revelation. I believe in things like that. And another thing that God told me was that I would have 2 daughters. So we didn't find out my son's gender. And I should also say my husband was an identical twin. So we had the girl first, and his identical twin had 3 girls first. So that's like the same man having 4 girls in a row. So I thought we were going to have girls, you know? So my son was a surprise. But God had told me, "You will have 2 daughters." And I was devastated when Bruce and I split up, because I really believed that he had killed our second daughter. I was going to name her Evelyn Ivy. And I put this little thing on my wall. I put 1 Corinthians 7:15, "Let the unbelieving husband depart." And I put Evelyn Ivy, last name, in memory of a dream. And I let go of Evelyn Ivy. I mean, how do you grieve someone who doesn't exist? And I knew I sounded like a crazy person, but she was supposed to exist, and now she wasn't going to. We got divorced, and I finished my master's thesis on Mormon theology. I wrote about women in exaltation. a Mormon feminist, Maxine Hanks. She's pretty famous. She was excommunicated. She was one of the September 6th.
She's a friend. Yep.
She's a friend. She was on my master's thesis committee. She was my external reader. I was very close to her. I should also say, while all this was going on, when I was during the interfaith marriage era, I presented at Sunstone once, and it was like standing room only almost. It was like a packed room. Rick Bennett was there, by the way, and he still remembers it. He mentioned it on a podcast recently. He still remembers it like 12 years later, but I presented on women in early Christianity, and I was like a rock star. Like, usually with an academic conference, you're lucky if 8 people come to your presentation. I had like 50 people there. It was amazing. But it went very well, and I met Maxine Hanks. She was my respondent, and then she agreed to be my external reader. But I wrote this thesis on women in Mormon exaltation. I critiqued the temple ceremony, and a couple years later, the church changed everything, almost everything that I critiqued in my master's thesis. So there have been many other policies towards women that I have critiqued over the years that the church has also changed. I cannot prove that anyone in Salt Lake City reads my stuff, but sure feels like it sometimes. So that happened.
They're reading your stuff.
Okay.
Just like they're watching my channel.
Exciting.
Yeah.
But I was also the first non-Mormon to participate in something called the Mormon Theology Seminar that's done by the Maxwell Institute. I did this in 2016, the same year that I graduated. It was a couple years after my divorce. I was a single mom. And yeah, they were super, super kind to me. I was the first non-Mormon. I was the only person that didn't have a PhD, which I felt very sensitive about. I was the only one there who just had a master's degree, but they really, and like Matt Bowman that was there. I can't share a stage with Matt Bowman, but no, they were super affirming and they were super encouraging. And I would just say, if there's evangelical or non-Mormon scholars out there that are interested in Mormonism, absolutely apply to the Mormon Theology Seminar. I think that I can't speak for Adam Miller and Joseph Smith. They would be happy to have you. And I talked with one of the people there. He said that his dad had cheated on his mom, and his dad had actually gotten the church to excommunicate his mom or discipline his mom, even though his dad was the one who had cheated. So kind of talked about my trauma with this infidelity and things like that with my ex. But yeah, that's pretty much my BYU story from start to finish. I just have some updates about where people are today.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to thank you so much for telling your story, which I think was very powerful. I think this is going to resonate with a lot of people. I think you're the perfect guest for this for this channel, because your story, your evangelical world and your Mormon world are so intermeshed with each other. You'll always be part of who you are in your identity. You are just like I am, a product of the Restoration, a product of Joseph Smith. We are products of it. It has influenced our lives. It's informed us for who we are. And in many ways, I think we could both say we're both grateful for the Restoration.
For sure.
So I think that's the way we look at it, right? We're not haters. We love y'all.
I refer to my background as quasi-Mormon. That's usually the term I use. I was never actually LDS, but for sure the Mormons shaped me in certain ways. And
I like that quasi-Mormon.
My heart belongs to Utah, for sure. My heart belongs to Utah. So.
Yeah. I love it. So you wanted to give some updates because, of course, this is a story that's over 20, covers a period of over 20 years, almost like 25 years.
Yeah.
So you said you wanted to kind of just do like a update on some of the people that had an impact on your life.
People have gone in interesting directions. So when I came out to Chicago, after that pastor told me to go away, I wound up visiting the Evangelical Covenant Church, Deer Grove Covenant Church in Palatine. And so I wound up joining the Evangelical Covenant Church. If I haven't, this whole story, I've gone Nazarene, Presbyterian, Assemblies of God, and now I'm at the Evangelical Covenant Church, which has now been my church home for 13 years. Okay. But here's something interesting. Sumner Presbyterian Church, the PCUSA church that was my home back in high school, they are now Faith Covenant Church. They also came to the covenant independently of me. So my old home came over to my new home. Oh. I recently reconnected with the Harris family on Facebook, the Mormon family from high school, who I had thought were so wholesome, who had everything I thought I wanted, who tried so hard to convert me. I took the missionary discussions with them and the missionaries. Brother and Sister Harris divorced a few years ago. Brother Harris has not attended church in years. Sister Harris is remarried to someone else, and my high school friend appears to be prog-Mormon and/or ex-Mormon and has also not attended the church in many years. My friend from high school reports that everyone is happier with these changes. Apparently, my perceptions of them were never correct. Ed Decker follows me on academia, where he has read my master's thesis on Mormon women in exaltation. For being the undisputed champion of 1980s anti-Mormonism, he's surprisingly nice. And we've had several ironic conversations there. I believe I've joked to him that we're the only two evangelicals to have ever gotten the temple ceremony changed. Life takes you to strange places sometimes. Sean, the young man who introduced me to Mormonism and then broke my heart, he eventually wound up at BYU with me, where we had a refreshingly wholesome and platonic friendship, and even took a class or two together. He got married to a non-Mormon in 2012. He described his wife as a, quote, non-denominational Christian or Pentecostal, but as far as I know, he's still very much believing himself. They have one daughter together. Sean and I remain friends to this day. Sean, if you watch this, you know who you are. You know your name's not Sean. You need to do your Duolingo questing when you're paired with me, buddy. Like, I'm tired of me carrying the weight here, okay? But anyway, Hales, my freshman, it's complicated. Earned a PhD in aeronautical and astronautical engineering from Purdue. He got married in 2011 in the Nauvoo Temple to a 5'11" Lutheran woman who had converted to Mormonism for him. They have 4 children together. Hales and I remain friends, and although we do not talk often, we always have good conversations when we do. Rivka, the Hebrew 101 teacher who married her student, is still married to Mordecai 22 years later. They have 6 children together. Kylie Turley continues to teach writing at BYU and has now authored a commentary on the first half of the Book of Alma and the Book of Mormon. Kylie, did you quote my essay in your commentary? I'm going to be a little disappointed with you if you didn't. But I'm just joking around. I cannot recommend her enough as a writing instructor. Nick and Julie Frederick have been married for over 20 years, and Nick is now an associate professor of ancient scripture in the BYU religion department. They have 4 children together. Julia helped me with my Latin for an upcoming article, and I will be thanking her in a footnote. I visited Utah last November, and we all had lunch together. Eric Huntsman is currently serving as the director of the BYU Jerusalem Center. Oh. I last saw him in November, and he told me he's come to prefer administration to teaching, but that's a shame because he is one hell of a good teacher and a good man and a Christian, and I cannot recommend his classes highly enough. I reached out to the man I have called Dr. Young last November while I was visiting Utah. He did not want to have visitors in person, but we spoke on the phone. I told him, oh, I forgot to say, I'm sorry, I forgot to tell the story. Dr. Young did not like Bruce. He was the only person in my life who forcefully told me I could do better. And I was shocked, okay? So I told him he was right about Bruce, that I could do better, and I did do better. And I told him how much he meant to me. I told him I'd had several Christian publishers express interest in my dissertation work, and he told me which one he thought I should go with if I got a choice. It was the last time we ever spoke in this life. I didn't ask him about the BYU cult thing. I knew he wouldn't tell me. It was the last time we ever spoke in this life. He passed away on March 14th, 2023, one day short of the Ides of March, which I imagine he's big mad about, but maybe he just wanted to spend the afterlife with Caesar. Spend the Ides of March with Caesar. Love is hard to unlearn, even when we should know better. And I can never stop loving Dr. Young, but I do want to say that I am sorry to the people he hurt. Brent Smith, the second counselor in the Arlington Heights First Ward who confronted Bruce that day he brought Aurora to church. Brent went on to become the bishop of that same ward. He is currently serving as the stake president of the Schaumburg stake. I think that the people there are incredibly lucky to have Brent, and I think that the only person who could possibly be a better stake president than Brent is Brent's wife, Amy. Amy disagrees with this, but I stand by my assessment. Also, Brent is an actual employee of the LDS Church. He's one of the few people who's on the payroll for the LDS Church. So whatever you guys pay him, it's not enough. He didn't complain about this to me. I'm just saying, he's phenomenal. You're lucky to have him. You don't pay him enough. Aurora, my interfaith Protestant replacement, abruptly broke up with Bruce just before our divorce was final because she wanted to date someone else. How you get them is how you lose them. She married the man she left Bruce for, and that man is now an associate pastor of a church in Wisconsin. Aurora is on staff as their worship leader. Bruce and I have been divorced for almost 9 years. In that time, he has never seriously dated an active Mormon woman, even though the LDS Church has plenty of single and active Mormon women in their 30s and 40s. To my knowledge, he no longer wears his garments and does not attend the LDS Church. He had accused me of trying to make him fall away many, many times in that first year, and it feels to me like he made himself fall away in the end. He has been with his current girlfriend for 2 or 3 years. I do not believe she is a member. No quarrel with her. She seems like a nice person. In the past year, there's been some events between us. I would not say there has been healing, but perhaps there is something of a truce between us. And this is my epilogue. I went into the wilderness. I was a single mom for several years. So on the evening of March 16th, on the day of March 16th, 2016, 3 big things happened in my life. I turned in the defense copy of my master's thesis. I drove to a plastic surgeon and had a nose job and fixed my giant crooked nose. And I got home. I had the cast on my nose. By the way, my brother drove me home. And he's looking at my cast and he goes, "Wow, that really is different." I'm like, "Thank you." And he's like, "I always thought your nose looked like a witch's nose, but I knew you couldn't do anything about it, so I didn't want to hurt your feelings, but it's really different now." And I'm like, "That's the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me." But I fixed my nose. This plastic surgeon said it was the most dramatic one he's ever done. I'm no longer self-conscious about that. And on the same day, there's a message in my inbox from a Christian man on OkCupid. These 3 things on the very same day. We were both raised in Alaska. We were a 99% match on OkCupid. And he had been looking at my profile for several days, but he wasn't sure about approaching me because I believed in women pastors and he didn't. He finally sent me a message thinking, she's not going to write back. And he was incorrect. I wrote back within the hour. We met in person about a month later. And I was dating him when I went to the Mormon theology seminar, but I wasn't sure about him. And I asked the people at the Mormon theology seminar, "What do you think of this guy I'm dating?" And several of them said they gave him the thumbs up and they encouraged me to date him. So he spread his wing over us and accepted my children as his own. And we got married in 2018. Our ceremony was performed by Katie Langston, a former Mormon who is now an ordained minister in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. If she had declined, I was going to ask Eric Huntsman to marry us. He was my next choice. Also,
Katie's been on my program. Yeah, Katie's been on the program.
Yeah, she's definitely been a little part of my story with the blogging that we never got to get into, but we've known each other for years.
Wow.
I was going to ask Eric Huntsman. Okay, I already read that.
Yeah.
Also, my second husband is 2.5 inches shorter than me. He never minds when I wear heels. I just want to say to the ladies out there, there's nothing wrong with dating a guy who's a little shorter or a lot shorter than you, okay? Height doesn't matter. Give the short kings a chance. My new husband wanted a baby, and I wanted a PhD. So we came to an arrangement, and I got pregnant in 2019. And when we found out the baby's gender, I was not even a little bit surprised that it was a girl. It was my second daughter. She took the long way, but she made it to me because God is faithful and his promises are always true. And what other people mean for evil, he means for good. And he can always restore what others destroy. So I'm about halfway through a PhD program in church history at Trinity. I have my first peer-reviewed journal article coming out whenever the Trinity Journal publishes it. They're the same journal that published Mormon Scholarship Apologetics and Evangelical Neglect so many years ago. I have other articles submitted or about to be submitted, and I presented at the annual meeting of the Evangelical Theological Society last year, a presentation on Romans 16:7 that Michael F. Bird called devastating. He said it was the best presentation he saw between ETS and SBL. While I was there, I briefly met Carl Mosher, Frank Beckwith, and Craig Blomberg in person for the first time, all heroes to me for so long. I hope to be done with my PhD in 2026. I also preach every 3 months at Deer Grove Covenant Church in Palatine. I sometimes teach Christian formation there. I'm discussing the possibility of bivocational certification there, which is a quasi-ordination status. I currently live in a cocoon of patristics and exegetical history, and there's not much room for Mormonism in that cocoon. But when I emerge from the cocoon, I do hope to write more interfaith things. And sometimes I will be critical, even harshly critical of the LDS Church, and sometimes I will affirm the good that I see there. But always I will come from a place of affection and respect. That's my story.
That's your story. Well, I want to appreciate you so much for coming on today, Bridget. Of course, a lot of people back then knew you as Jack.
Yes,
So
I went by Jack back then. I answer to both, but
yes,
yeah,
for both.
I go by Bridget more often these days.
So we go by Bridget Jack Jeffries. What a powerful story. This is quite one of the more remarkable. I mean, I've had some pretty remarkable interviews. I've had interesting and remarkable conversations with people. This has to be one of the top ones that I've done. So it's a real privilege to have been able to interact with you. I'm sure my audience will feel the same way. What a powerful story. What a complicated story. You know,
I'm
it's
sorry
not
for
all.
the crying, you guys.
Oh, it's all
I
right.
said I wasn't going to cry, but
It's all
we went
good.
to
But
places I wasn't expecting.
well, and I think that's good to get it out there, and so people can get to know you. And I think, but I love it because you and I have shown that it's not always black and white. It's not always that we've intermixed ourselves so much with the Restoration. You more so than me, in that it only 2.5 years ago I didn't even know a Mormon. It wasn't until I started the channel I started interacting with them. But we both have been affected by the Restoration, and so and we also are. We want to be part of the conversation happening within the Restoration, and I think because we are able to show that we can be we can do it in a Christian way, and we can do it in a way that's completely opposite of what the many of the counter cult people are doing, the so-called Christian apologists are doing, that really bother me tremendously. I think that I always tell people I just look for the fruits, and so many times I just don't see any fruits from these people. I just see anger and hatred and
Right.
paranoia. And
Mhm.
I had an experience with an LDS scholar who had this engagement with this fairly well-known Christian apologist who doesn't like me. But he said the look on his face, the anger and the hatred that he had towards him was just shook him to the core. I mean, he was telling me about it at the Mormon History Association, and it was just like, man, they're not seeing Christ. And I think it's most important that we recognize that, you and I are both very different compared to a lot of what's going on. But I do think that there is this growing conversation that's happening. You in the academic world. Then there's people like Jeff McCullough of Hello Saints, and David Boyce of 52 Churches in 52 Weeks. And we got Dr. Kyle Bashirs, who is doing a great work.
Kyle. Yep.
Yeah, Kyle's doing great work. And so we're having different kinds of conversations. So we're just two voices in this hopefully growing chorus of evangelicals that want to have true engagement, true Christian engagement with the people of the Restoration. So, Bridget, what an awesome talk we had today. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for having me.
So don't forget, folks, if you want to help support the channel, there's links for Patreon, as well as Venmo now, as well as PayPal. Don't forget our merch store, MormonBookReviews.com. You can get t-shirts, hats, hot chocolate mugs, even like mouse pads, so whatever. It's there at the website, folks. But remember, this is the most important thing is this, folks. Remember, all the voices of the Restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.